On the night Marina Soltero vanished from Stockton, California, the yellowish, high-pressure sodium lights still cast their glow over the parking lot behind the row of stores on Pacific Avenue, where evening shift college students and off-duty employees came and went, as on any ordinary day. It was an early fall night, warmer than usual, the heat still rising in waves from the asphalt as the shops gradually turned off their lights, leaving only the small bookstore where the 19-year-old girl was preparing to lock the back door. Around nearly 10 o'clock at night, a coworker saw Marina sling her backpack over her shoulder, remove the Brookhaven name badge from her shirt before stepping out the back door leading to the nearly empty parking lot, then wave goodbye through the foggy glass pane. The silver bracelet engraved with the initials M.S. glinted under her denim sleeve cuff as she pushed the heavy metal door, the last image of Marina in the world that the old analog camera managed to capture. What happened in less than an hour after that moment would haunt Stockton for more than 3 decades. As a gray van, a scar on the back of a hand, and a nylon bag hidden in the ceiling turned into the darkest puzzle this city had ever faced. Before diving deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the latest cases. That night, Stockton, California dawned an unusually quiet autumn tranquility, when the temperature was just cool enough for breaths to turn into thin wisps of smoke in the air. Beyond the commercial strip along Pacific Avenue, the parking lot was nearly deserted, with only a few cars sitting silently under the faded yellow high-pressure lights. A light wind blew, enough to make the tree canopies along the lot's edge rustle softly, their branch shadows intertwining and stretching long across the asphalt like twisted black ink streaks. The back door of the Brookhaven bookstore swung open, white light from inside spilling out in a sharp rectangle into the night before, quickly being swallowed as the door closed. Marina Soltero stepped out, her backpack slung over one shoulder, a thin jacket hugging her slender frame, her long hair clipped neatly at the nape to reveal her pale neck. She was just 19 years old, a freshman at Delta College, accustomed to ending late shifts on evenings when Stockton flickered with lights like this. Marina's steps were quick but unhurried, the kind of stride of someone who had walked this path hundreds of times, knowing by heart every crack in the pavement, every flickering light spot, every patch of darkness to cross through. The air around her thickened in an indescribable way. Distant car sounds from Pacific Avenue echoed like muffled ocean waves. The steady hum of air conditioners from behind the building mingled with newspaper pages blown by the wind rustling against the metal fence. Overhead, a street lamp flickered, bright then dark, as if deciding whether to keep burning for one more night. The old analog camera mounted above the Brookhaven's back door unwittingly became a silent witness. In the few seconds of its grainy footage, one would see Marina step out of the frame, adjust her backpack strap, then suddenly slow down. She tilted her head, her eyes turning to the left, toward something out of the camera's view, as if she had just heard someone call her name, or noticed something that didn't belong in this familiar scene. In a brief moment, her body paused, her torso slightly turning. Then, as if reassuring herself, Marina turned back to her original direction and continued walking. She ventured deeper into the parking lot, where the light from the commercial area faded behind her, leaving a wide, dark expanse ahead, the lot's edge where streetlights didn't reach, where the white painted lines on the asphalt also sank into shadow. From the door of a nearby eatery, an employee pulling down the shutter glanced over and saw Marina's silhouette glide by. He raised his hand in habitual greeting, the kind shared by people who see each other every evening without ever exchanging words. And in that brief instant, Marina smiled, her chin lifting slightly, her hand leaving the backpack strap to wave back. That image, to him, held nothing special until many days later, when he realized it was the last time he saw her. Marina vanished among the tree shadows and the silent cars. There was no scream tearing through the atmosphere, no sound of struggle, nothing but the wind and the sound of a soda can rolling somewhere on the concrete before stopping. The night dragged on, hour by hour, slowly and heavily. In the small house in North Stockton where her family lived, the living room light stayed on, the wall clock kept ticking, but the familiar sound of Marina's footsteps never rang out at the door. At first, everyone tried to reassure themselves. Maybe she was held up at school. Maybe she went out with friends. Maybe she forgot to call. They phoned a few of Marina's close friends, but everyone gave the same answer. No one had seen her after her shift at the bookstore. The phone rang, stopped, then rang again, but no number belonging to Marina appeared on the screen. Outside, Stockton remained silent, as on any other night. But inside that house, the empty space where she usually sat gradually became oppressively heavy. When the reasonable explanations finally ran out, when every harmless assumption could no longer hold up against the reality that Marina had vanished without a trace, her family understood that this had gone far beyond ordinary delays. They were forced to do what no family ever wants to do: step out of the house, gaze into the mute Stockton night, and report to the authorities that Marina Soltero was missing. Stockton PD didn't take long to realize this wasn't a case of a young college student coming home late and crashing at a friend's place. As soon as they heard the family describe Marina as punctual, with a fixed routine, no conflicts with anyone, and never having run away before, the night shift investigators immediately crossed off voluntary runaway from the board. In their eyes, this was a suspicious disappearance, and if there was any hope of finding her safe, every passing hour was something they couldn't afford to waste. The night shift called in the criminal investigation team, bringing more people to the Pacific Avenue commercial area while the sky was still dark and the yellow parking lot lights hadn't yet gone out. They split up into 3 directions almost instinctively. One group went inside the bookstore to obtain the camera recording. One group set up a blockade of the back parking lot, and the remaining group started canvassing the list of anyone who might have seen Marina in her final hours. In the cramped break room behind the Bookhaven's cashier counter, the old analog VCR was placed on the table. An investigator leaned close to the screen, rewinding and fast-forwarding the tape that had been removed from the machine, examining each grainy frame as if it were covered in a thick fog. They dimmed the lights, pulled chairs right up close, trying to peel apart every tiny detail that the naked eye might have initially missed. Marina appeared on the screen, a slightly noisy black and white silhouette, stepping out the back door, adjusting her backpack strap. They clearly saw the moment she slowed down, her head tilting slightly, her gaze turning to one side, toward the edge of the frame, completely submerged in darkness. Outside, another group walked along the white-painted lines on the parking lot asphalt, sweeping flashlight beams as they went. They marked the areas covered by the camera and the blind spots outside its view, the dark patches between light poles, the hidden places behind dumpsters or the brick walls behind the stores. Every still warm cigarette butt, every tire track clearer than usual was collected into evidence bags. They noted the position of every piece of trash that seemed out of place, not because it was necessarily related, but because in the first hours, anything could become a puzzle piece later. Along the row of stores, they knocked on every door that still had lights on inside. The eatery employee opened up with eyes still red from lack of sleep. The warehouse guard appeared in a wrinkled uniform. Everyone was asked the same question. When was the last time you saw the girl who works at the bookstore? Most only remembered vague markers sometime after dinner hours, before we closed, but one employee from the neighboring fast food place remembered a bit more clearly. He said he'd seen Marina walking past, looking down at the ground as if lost in thought, then disappearing toward the far end of the lot. He still remembered her brief smile when he raised his hand in greeting. When the investigator pressed further about whether he'd noticed anything unusual, he hesitated, then mentioned that over the past few weeks he'd occasionally seen a man standing in the corner of the parking lot where the light didn't reach. The man wasn't smoking, wasn't pacing, just leaning against the wall, as if waiting for someone or simply wanting to blend into the shadows. He'd never seen Marina interact directly with the man, but the repetition of that sight had started making him wonder if there was some connection he'd overlooked. Those sparse but sharp details were recorded immediately. At headquarters, a few hours later, these scattered pieces were pinned up on the whiteboard in the investigation team's meeting room. Marina's name was written in red marker right in the center, surrounded by small boxes. Bookstore. End of shift. Eatery employee. Saw Marina smile. Man in dark corner. Appeared multiple times. Camera. Marina turns head. Area out of view. The lead investigator, who had handled plenty of missing persons cases, instructed the team to temporarily set aside any emotional assumptions. They had no time for imagination. They were only allowed to rely on what was definitively seen. They began building a timeline, not with minute-precise timestamps, but with event markers clear enough to pin down. Marina left home while it was still light. Arrived for her shift at the Bookhaven. Marina ended her shift when the commercial area had quieted down. Marina stepped out the back door. Marina paused, turned her head, then continued walking. Marina was seen by the neighboring eatery employee. After that, no one saw her again. The gaps between those markers were where anything could have happened. The investigator added to the timeline a series of questions awaiting answers. Who had reason to approach her in the back lot? Who is the man in the dark corner? Did any vehicle leave the area around the time Marina vanished? Meanwhile, another group was assigned to recanvass all the stores, bus stops, and gas stations within a few block radius to ask if anyone remembered seeing Marina or a strange vehicle that night. The interviews continued right through the first day, with no option to postpone until tomorrow. When a young woman vanishes in the middle of a city without leaving a single message, every passing hour blurs the trail a little more. Stockton PD understood that very well, and they began racing against an invisible enemy named Time, with only a few grainy frames and an account of the man in the dark corner as their starting point. The next morning, as the first sunlight spilled over that usually silent parking lot, the investigators began the second round of interviews, this time expanding beyond just those who worked in the commercial area to anyone who had been around Pacific Avenue on the evening Marina vanished. Very quickly, a repeating pattern emerged. Multiple people mentioned the figure of a man near the back parking lot, but each one painted a version so different that it seemed like they were describing three completely unrelated strangers. The first was a delivery worker familiar with the area, who had come to the eatery that night to pick up an order. He remembered a middle-aged man wearing a denim jacket and a baseball cap, leaning against the brick wall near the far end of the lot. He said the man had a slightly hunched posture, hands always in his pockets, head bowed low, as if avoiding eye contact with others. He wasn't doing anything, but the way he stood there, in the dark, just watching, it gave me the creeps, he said, hesitating because he wasn't sure if he was exaggerating his own memory. The second witness was a middle-aged woman who worked the evening shift at the laundromat across the street and occasionally smoked during breaks behind her store, looking over toward the Bookhaven lot. In her memory, the man looked younger, around his early 30s, wearing a light-colored athletic jacket, no hat, hair cut short in a military style. She even insisted she had seen him a few times, always standing far enough from the light pole for the darkness to cover half his face. She didn't recall details about his posture, but firmly stated that he never looked toward the stores, only toward the girls walking out to the parking lot. By the third witness, the story veered in yet another direction. A homeless man who often slept near the back of the shopping center told police he had seen a man big-built, wearing a black baseball cap and a dark jacket pacing back and forth between the rows of cars, not standing still. He added the detail that the man would sometimes stop, look down at the ground, as if searching for something or hiding something. When asked about height, build, shoes, all the answers were vague, overlapping like smoke, but the one common thread among the three portraits was the location, the same far end of the parking lot, where the camera couldn't reach. In the police station meeting room, the three descriptions were written on 3 separate sheets of paper and pinned side by side on the board. The bullet points highlighting similarities, male, alone, appeared multiple times, were surrounded by a sea of conflicting information. Denim jacket, light-colored, dark-colored, hunched posture, straight back, standing still, pacing back and forth. The investigation team knew that human memory, especially of details that seemed unimportant at the time, is easily distorted by time, fear, and even stories heard from others later. But at the same time, the fact that 3 different people, from 3 different vantage points, all mentioned a man who didn't belong there, could not be dismissed as mere coincidence. They couldn't create an accurate composite sketch, but they could mark the area where that presence kept recurring. While one group of investigators sat in front of the whiteboard rearranging the puzzle pieces of statements, Another team of officers was sent out to gather one more piece of information, this time from the younger crowd who tended to stay out later. The group of teenagers who often hung around near the parking lot, Stockton kids raised on cassette tapes, old pickup trucks, and nights cruising, the commercial strip became the new interview targets. 4 boys, 16 or 17 years old, sat awkwardly at the table, hands clasped together, mixing a bit of excitement about talking to the police with a vague unease. They admitted they had been near the lot that night, playing makeshift basketball with a hoop temporarily attached to the brick wall out back, listening to music from a small radio placed on a beer crate. When asked if they had heard anything unusual, at first all shook their heads. Only when an investigator prompted them about screaming, arguing, or an unusual car engine starting did one of them slowly say he thought he heard something like an argument coming from the bookstore side of the lot. He couldn't be sure it was Marina's voice, nor could he recall exactly whether it was one person or two, just vaguely a higher-pitched female voice and a low male voice, followed by the sound of a car door slamming hard. His friends didn't immediately agree. One said he only heard the radio music, another recalled some noise, but it could have been someone dropping a trash can. That vagueness made the story seem stretched between reality and imagination. But the investigator recorded everything, leaving out no detail. They were used to working with distorted fragments of memory. What mattered was not catching someone in a wrong statement, but finding the overlapping segments among the accounts. From one perspective, the entire group of teens agreed on one thing. The back parking lot had not been completely silent as imagined. There had been sounds, there had been movement, and for at least a few minutes, there may have been interaction between a man and a girl. When compiling those statements, the investigator used a different colored marker to highlight a line on the board. Possibility that Marina did not leave the parking lot alone. That sentence didn't prove she was forced, nor did it confirm she willingly went with someone, but it shattered the initial assumption that Marina had vanished entirely alone that night. The presence of another person, even with an unclear face and conflicting descriptions in the picture, changed the structure of the problem. From the question, "Where did she go?" to "Who was the last person with her?" and "Why has that person disappeared from every account?" When the reliability of each individual witness was rated low, the investigators were forced to think differently. Not relying on single statements, but on the points where they intersected. That man, whatever jacket he wore, whether he had a hat or not, young or middle-aged, seemed to always stand or move around the same hidden area of the back lot at the same general time. The teens might have misremembered the volume of the argument, but the detail of a car door slamming hard, in the silence of a nearly empty parking lot, was something hard to mishear. In the cramped space of the meeting room, where the whiteboard was starting to fill with arrows, circles, and notes, the investigator underlined 3 times the words, "unidentified male subject." They didn't have a face yet, no license plate, no DNA, but they had one thing, a new focal point for their questions, and that was enough to turn a series of seemingly scattered, unreliable statements into a suggestion. The night Marina vanished from Stockton, she was not truly alone in the darkness of the parking lot behind the Brookhaven. While the investigation team continued cycling between witnesses and the timeline diagram on the whiteboard, another detail quietly emerged from something everyone initially thought they'd examined enough: the analog camera tape from the Brookhaven. This time, instead of focusing solely on Marina's gait, the direction of her gaze, or the moment she paused, they were instructed to look at everything else in the frame. They rewound and fast-forwarded the tape with a different goal. Not to see what she was doing, but to see what was around her. At a much slower speed than normal, the frames that had been just blurry gray patches began revealing more detail. The glass door behind Marina, as she stepped out, didn't just reflect the light from inside the store, it also reflected a moving dark patch on the opposite side of the parking lot. In 2 or 3 brief frames, that dark patch was no longer a meaningless smear, but resembled a human figure, broad shoulders, upper body leaning slightly forward, standing about a dozen or more steps from the door. No one could see a face, only the outline of one shoulder and the left arm in motion, seemingly raising and then lowering, like the gesture of someone signaling or reaching into a pocket. An imaging technician used a marker to circle the reflected area on the screen, then zoomed in bit by bit. Even knowing that with the quality of a 1992 recording, zooming really just stretched the noise pixels. But even those noise pixels, when observed by eyes trained to interpret faint black and white specks, could yield something. In one frame, the silhouette tilted slightly to the right. In the next, the left arm protruded more clearly. Then, the entire dark mass shifted a little, as if the person had just shifted weight from one foot to the other. The investigator noted, arm movement present, posture change, not standing motionless. The distance between Marina and the reflected figure was estimated by comparing her relative size in the frame to the size of the dark patch on the glass door. One team member with experience reconstructing scenes remeasured the actual back door dimensions, Marina's height, and the camera-to-door distance directly at the site. They marked a spot in the parking lot less than 15 feet from the door, then had each other stand there while recording a new test tape to compare reflection angles. The result was very close. At exactly that spot, a human figure would appear on the glass with a size almost matching the faint shadow in the original tape. That gave them one thing. The man wasn't standing far away. He wasn't a distant silhouette at the edge of the lot casually passing by, but someone present in the area very close to the back exit, within reach of contacting Marina if he wanted to. The next question was, what was that arm motion? Someone waving? Someone pulling out a cigarette? Someone adjusting a bag strap? Or someone in the act of opening a car door? The answer wasn't on the tape, but the motion was distinct enough to make everyone fall silent for a few seconds when it was played in slow motion on the CRT screen. They sat there, in the nearly pitch-black room, only the pale blue glow from the monitor lighting their faces, watching that shadow repeat. Arm raising, lowering, body leaning slightly forward. One investigator muttered, if he was just hanging around, why stand that close to the door? They began comparing that hazy image to what the three witnesses had described. The delivery worker mentioned a slightly hunched posture, hands always in pockets. The laundromat woman remembered a man who often stood in shadowed areas. The homeless man spoke of someone pacing between rows of cars. The reflection on the glass wasn't clear enough to confirm or refute any of those descriptions. But there were two overlapping points. It was a male, and he clearly wasn't a regular customer. Just passing through. People don't stand near the back door, in the dark, that long without a reason. A hypothesis was raised at the table. Could it be some employee from the commercial area, out for a smoke or a break? They verified uniforms, shifts, and habits of every worker in the vicinity. No one claimed to have been standing in that spot the night Marina vanished. The neighboring stores' uniforms, aprons, logo t-shirts, light-colored khakis also didn't help connect the black shadow on the glass to a specific face. In some frames, the sleeve area appeared lighter or darker than the background, but the noise made no one able to say for sure. The lead investigator requested multiple copies of that tape segment, sending them to the department's imaging unit and an independent video processing firm. He didn't expect miracles. He just wanted another set of eyes on the same thing, in case they spotted what he'd missed. While waiting for those results, he returned to the scene multiple times, standing near the back door, looking out at the parking lot, then turning to look at the glass surface. He tried to visualize what the man standing there would see as Marina stepped out. If he was waiting, he could see her before she saw him, because the light behind her would make her stand out like a bright streak against the dark. Meanwhile, Marina, stepping from bright interior to semi-darkness, would need a few seconds for her eyes to adjust. A slight sound, a soft call from ahead, could have been enough to make her turn her head, just as the tape recorded. Those were deductions based on simple physics, but in a case with few clear things, deductions like that started getting written as lines in the file. The reflected figure on the glass door became the clue least dependent on emotion they had about the man in the dark corner. It wasn't distorted by subjective memory, not embellished by fear, after learning Marina was missing. It was something that had been there from the first night, only no one had thought to look in the right place until now. On the whiteboard, next to the boxes noting witness statements, a printout photo from the camera screen was taped up. The image of Marina stepping out the door, head slightly turned away, and right behind her, in the reflective glass layer, the vague, dark outline of another human figure. Below the photo, someone wrote in red marker, "Confirms at least 2 people in the scene when Marina exits the back door." That, once again, reinforced the notion that Marina had not left that parking lot alone. And if that man wasn't an employee, wasn't a random passerby, then who was he? And why had his presence that night been overlooked during the most critical first hours and days of the investigation? The search of the area around the Brookhaven didn't stop at the parking lot and the row of stores. Right after reviewing the camera tape again and drawing a preliminary circle around where Marina vanished, the investigators expanded the search radius to the narrow streets, shortcuts, and empty spaces behind the old brick buildings. They divided the area behind Pacific Avenue into grid squares on the map, numbering them in a standard search pattern. Each team responsible for one square, walking methodically, bending down, sweeping flashlights over every clump of grass, every step, every crack between concrete blocks. It wasn't glamorous work. Most of what they collected was just empty soda cans, cigarette butts, bottle caps, food wrappers, and the kind of trash any parking lot in a busy city would have. However, everything changed when a young officer stopped beside a narrow strip of ground between the brick wall and the iron fence separating the lot from a little-used alley. It was a spot people rarely noticed. Wide enough for one person to slip through, but not an official pathway. The ground uneven with gravel, a few weeds growing ankle-high. He bent down when his flashlight beam caught something colored differently from the dirty gray of the ground. Next to a broken brick, lying close to the base of the fence, was a small, pale blue plastic piece. When he picked it up and blew off the thin layer of dust covering it, embossed lettering appeared. The Delta College logo, and the name Marina Soltero below it, along with a tiny ID photo of her in the corner. This was clearly Marina's student ID card. The card wasn't snapped in half, only the edge slightly scratched and the surface coated with a thin layer of dust, as if it had been there for a very short time. No one on the search team thought this was a coincidence. The evidence was immediately placed in a marked nylon bag, its position on the map recorded precisely, a few hundred meters from the Brookhaven's back door. Not in the direction Marina usually took to reach the main road, but deviated in another direction, a roundabout path leading to a rarely used alley, then connecting to the main street. When the investigator returned to the scene with the map in hand, he stood at the back door where Marina had stepped out, imagining her familiar route. From the door across the parking lot, turning right toward the lighted section, walking a bit farther to the bus stop or family pickup spot. That was the straight, well-lit, predictable way. But the student ID's location lay to the left and farther back from that straight line, in a place Marina would have no reason to pass through if following her routine. On the map, the investigator drew a thin red line from the back door to where the card was found. That line not only deviated but went into the least lighted area around, between the brick wall behind the stores and the old metal fence where streetlights barely reached. It was a path a local very familiar with the area might know, but a young woman who usually took the main route would rarely use. She didn't drop the ID here herself, one investigator said, unable to hide the certainty in his voice. A student ID was something Marina needed daily for campus life. It was tied to her identity, classes, the library. If she dropped it, she would likely notice right away when needing to use it, rather than leaving it lying in a strange patch of dirt like that. More importantly, the ID's position created a new marked point on the timeline, no longer relying solely on accounts. At some moment after leaving the back door, Marina, or someone carrying Marina's belongings, had been present at this spot. The question was, how did she get there? Walking willingly, being led, or being dragged? The fact that the card lay close to the fence along a narrow direction suggested that if it fell during movement, it wasn't on a wide-open path. Police began examining the ground surface around the discovery spot. There were no clear footprints, since the ground there was a mix of old concrete, gravel, and dirt. But they noticed some elongated drag marks, as if something heavy had been pulled through. It could have been a trash bag, it could have been a crate. But in this context, any dragging made people think of the worst possibility. The card was taken to the evidence room for photographing, fingerprint scanning, and checking for any remaining biological traces. Though they didn't expect much since it was a smooth plastic surface exposed outdoors, the full procedure was still carried out. Back at the scene, finding the student ID meant the entire search area map had to be redrawn. At this point, the back parking lot was no longer the sole epicenter. The investigation axis extended in the direction of the dropped card, through the narrow passage, across the alley, connecting to points previously not prioritized because they assumed Marina only took the straight route to the main road. This also forced the team to revisit the initial assumption about Marina's movement path in the minutes after leaving the camera's view. If she was approached by someone near the back door, there were two possibilities. Either she was forced into a vehicle right in the parking lot and taken elsewhere, or she was led on foot through this narrow path to another point where the perpetrator had a vehicle waiting. The card's position lay in between, like a comma in an unfinished sentence. It didn't tell the whole story, but it split the story into two clear parts, before reaching here and after leaving here. On the whiteboard in the investigation room, the student ID was drawn as a separate box, connected by an arrow from the Brookhaven's back door, with the note, "First physical evidence, confirming movement direction different from usual route. Possibility of being led or forced to move." This created a new anchor for the investigation. They no longer had to rely solely on speculation that someone was in the parking lot. Now they had evidence dropped along a route Marina didn't normally take. In a missing persons case, the intangible everything often creates a feeling of helplessness for investigators. The appearance of a specific object, with a name, a photo, directly tied to the victim, is the rare thing that gives them the sense of touching a real lead. Its position wasn't just a dot on the map. It was the first footprint not left by human memory. And from this footprint, all new questions began to emerge. Who had been with the girl carrying this card? And why was it left behind right there? The 1992 Stockton street map was spread out on the table like an old hide, its thin lines marking streets, alleys, and side paths that people often forget when just looking with the naked eye. No digital maps, no satellite images, just black ink lines and simple symbols. But to the investigators, it was the only thing that could help them see the area around the Brookhaven as it had existed on the night Marina vanished. They used markers to note the known points again. The bookstore's back door, the parking lot, the spot where the student ID fell, the small alley behind the fence where the card was found. A small red circle enclosed the back lot area. A second circle surrounded the alley zone and the narrow strip of land where the young officer bent down to pick up the card bearing Marina Soltero's name. From those two circles, they began drawing thin lines, not the routes Marina usually took, but the directions she might have been taken, in any form, without being seen by anyone. First was the most direct route, from the drop spot of the card, if continuing along the alley, skirting the brick wall, through an empty lot, then turning left. It would lead to a quiet side street with little traffic, connecting to a secondary parking area behind an old apartment complex. This was a place rarely passed at night, mostly resident parking, no cameras, sparse streetlights. If someone wanted to avoid being seen from Pacific Avenue or the main lot, leading Marina or dragging her through the narrow path, then out to that secondary area was a reasonable choice. They marked it as Direction 1. The second direction was more complicated. From the card drop spot, if going the opposite way, through a tight gap between two buildings, one could slip into a long alley running parallel to a larger road. This alley crossed a small street, where there was a public payphone booth and an old gas station that used to operate late at night. That was a spot where a waiting vehicle could quickly pick someone up and blend into main road traffic without drawing attention. With dim lights and constant engine noise, someone being pulled or pushed into a car there could be swallowed by the night's sounds. They marked that as Direction 2. The third direction was less obvious but raised more thoughts. From the card spot, if crossing an empty patch, climbing over the part of the fence bent down from time and misuse, it would lead to the back of a row of old warehouses, where a road intersected with the route toward the canal bank. No one claimed Marina, a petite girl, could have gone this way herself, but it was the perfect route for someone familiar with coming and going from the warehouse area and wanting to avoid all eyes. A truck or van could wait there, hidden behind concrete walls, and leave via the delivery vehicle path without passing the commercial front. This direction was marked as Direction 3. When the three routes were drawn on the map, they looked like dark veins from the heart of the commercial area. Spreading to parts of the city ordinary people rarely think about: the service paths, delivery roads, secondary lots, back alleys, forgotten warehouse zones. The investigator pointed to each line, asking the team, on these routes, was there any point overlapping with incidents they'd heard about? The answer came from dustier files, but no less valuable. They began pulling prior reports about women being followed in the same area, not limited to the night Marina disappeared. An older officer recalled that in the late 1980s and early 90s, there had been several calls reporting a strange man standing in the dark near secondary lots and the alley parallel to Pacific Avenue. When the old reports were pulled from storage and spread on the table next to the map, another picture gradually emerged. Red marks noting the locations of those incidents. In 1989, a woman reported someone following her from a grocery store to the secondary parking behind, vanishing into shadows when she turned around. In 1990, a Delta College student said she was followed by a strange man from the bus stop to near the alley with the payphone booth, only stopping when she got a friend to pick her up. In 1991, another report noted a man standing near the back warehouse area, staring at women passing by, but leaving before police arrived. When those points were dotted on the map, the old circles overlapped heavily, and then, gradually, Marina's three suspicious directions began aligning with areas previously reported for women being followed. Direction 1 crossed the secondary lot where the 1989 incident was reported. Direction 2 passed through the alley and payphone area where the 1990 student felt someone close behind her. Direction 3, leading to the warehouse back and road near the canal bank, lay entirely within the zone mentioned in the 1991 report. The three routes initially marked based on geographic logic suddenly gained another layer of meaning. They weren't just possible paths, but paths previously used by someone to make women feel hunted. This made the investigators tighten the link between Marina being pulled off her familiar route and a behavioral pattern that had been budding for years without being connected. They began cross-referencing times and descriptions in the old reports, looking for any repeating names, any license plates appearing more than once, any stalker descriptions matching what witnesses said about the man in the dark corner. Most prior reports were vague, ending with notes like, subject not located, subject left before unit arrived. But the common feeling, a man standing where light didn't reach, watching without direct approach, choosing hidden paths over bright fronts, repeated enough times to become a pattern. While waiting for lab results on the physical evidence, the investigation team marked these three directions as three branches of the same question. That night, if Marina was forced to leave the parking lot via a route she didn't choose, which branch did the person taking her select? And was that person the same one who had stood in Stockton's shadows for years before, testing his boundaries with followings that didn't touch, before finally deciding to go further on the night a 19-year-old girl stepped out the Brookhaven's back door and never returned? In the first days, while the three possible directions on the map were still being connected with red marker lines and questions, the case suddenly veered into a path that seemed very straightforward. From a tip called into the hotline, the first name to be truly circled on the whiteboard at the police station, Ricky Alvarez. He was 23 years old, working the evening security shift for an electronics store in the same row as the Brookhaven, and had been reprimanded a few times for talking too familiarly with female customers. The anonymous caller, a man's voice, said he didn't want trouble but felt he had to speak up. According to him, Ricky often went to the back parking lot after his shift, smoked, and struck up conversations with girls getting off late, including Marina. That night I saw him out there, the man's voice echoed on the recording. He said something to the long-haired girl from the bookstore. I didn't see what happened after that, but you guys should talk to him first. That was the kind of information no investigator could ignore, especially when it overlapped with the story of the man in the shadows and the habit of standing in the camera-blind area that witnesses had mentioned. Within hours, Ricky was invited in the way everyone understood meant brought in to the police station. On paper, He had no prior convictions or record. His file stopped at minor infractions like parking tickets. But Ricky's initial attitude didn't help him. In the first interview, he came across as defensive, irritated at being questioned in such detail about his schedule, resentful about being suspected just for standing in the lot, smoking after work. When asked if he knew Marina, Ricky said he had seen her a few times, exchanged casual hellos, but denied ever having a private conversation with her. The investigator across from him leaned forward, pressing, "Did you ever stand at the far end of the lot, in the dark, looking toward the bookstore's back door?" Ricky gave a faint smile and said, "It's less windy there, easier to smoke without freezing. Nobody told me I couldn't stand there." The answer was just defiant enough, just arrogant enough, combined with the fact that he was present near the scene on many nights, to make everything seem dangerously fitting. In the days that followed, most of the investigation team's resources were poured into checking Ricky. Work schedules, time cards, co-worker statements, his home phone call history, evidence of where he had been during the window when Marina vanished. They questioned managers, other security shifts, regular customers of the electronics store. One female employee said she had seen Ricky staring at Marina as she walked past. Another recounted that Ricky had once been complained about for overly forward jokes with female customers. Those details, if standing alone, were just scattered incidents in the life of a bored night shift worker. But placed next to a disappearance, they suddenly seemed heavier. Meanwhile, other tasks, like more thorough searches along the 3 suspicious directions, re-interviewing the teens about the argument sounds, or digging deeper into the prior, women following reports, were pushed down the priority list. The whole team was pulled into Ricky's orbit like metal to a magnet. If he was the man in the shadows, if he had approached Marina, then focusing on him made sense. But as the days passed, pieces of his alibi began to emerge, fitting together in a way no one on the team wanted. The electronics store's internal camera, a separate analog system no one initially thought to check because they assumed it only covered the sales floor, turned out to record until closing time a bit later than Marina's shift end. On the tape, at the moment Marina left the Bookhaven, Ricky was still cleaning inside, appearing multiple times in frame with a broom in hand. A coworker clearly remembered that day he was kept late for inventory and signed out on the log long after the backlot had emptied. A gas station receipt 2 blocks away showed Ricky's card used to buy gas and a soda, nearly an hour after Marina was last seen, at a location too far to fit the theory of him returning to the lot to approach her. As these objective data points stacked up, the picture of Ricky shifted. He wasn't a completely innocent man beyond suspicion. His sullen attitude, the way he got prickly when questioned about standing in the lot smoking, still made people dislike him, but he wasn't in the right place at the right time to be the last person with Marina. A younger investigator, who had stayed up nights cross-checking every line in the shift log against the camera, recalled the feeling of almost angry disappointment when having to erase Ricky's name from the center of the whiteboard. The heavily circled red name faded, then was overlaid by a new circle. Check not at scene during critical time. Procedurally, clearing Ricky as a suspect was the right call. But the cost was time, nearly 10 days since Marina's disappearance. 10 days they could have used to dig deeper into the 3 suspicious routes, to revisit files on the prior women-following cases, to question more people who might have seen a strange vehicle leaving the secondary lot or warehouse area. By the time Ricky was released from suspicion, the most fragile physical traces, tire marks, drag signs on the ground, small landscape changes, had almost certainly vanished. Only after the initial frustration settled, did some on the team start looking back at the whole sequence and ask themselves, why had they zeroed in on Ricky so fast? The most obvious answer was, because an anonymous call pointed straight at him. The caller left no identity, but the voice was confident, detailed, as if he had observed Ricky for a long time. He knew Ricky's usual lot times, knew he had talked to several girls, even knew the brand of cigarettes he smoked. That wasn't something a person passing by a few times would remember. When replaying the hotline recording, a veteran investigator, experienced enough to recognize when he was being steered in a certain direction, had a thought he didn't voice right away. What if the anonymous caller wasn't just a concerned citizen, but someone who benefited from police chasing Ricky for the first 10 days? That idea, at the time, only passed like a shadow. The case was still logged as subject cleared after investigation, the call filed with other tips under tip line anonymous. But somewhere, in unofficial personal notes, a few people underlined a small line. Possible someone deliberately steered investigation toward Ricky. Back then, they had no name, no face for that someone. But the seed of suspicion that the man in the shadows was not only good at hiding at the scene, but smart enough to manipulate the investigation's trajectory, had been planted, waiting years for the soil to let it sprout. 4 months after the night Marina vanished, the whiteboard that had once been crammed with names, arrows, and red and blue lines in the Stockton PD meeting room began to empty out gradually. Layers of sticky notes were peeled off, piled into thick case files, fastened with metal clips. The enlarged maps of the Pacific Avenue area, with the 3 possible directions marked in red marker, were rolled up and tucked into cardboard tubes. The photos taken from the grainy camera frames, the image of the reflected silhouette of a man on the glass door, the plastic student ID card bearing Marina's name, all were successively removed from the wall to lie flat in carefully numbered nylon bags. It wasn't because anyone thought the case was hopeless, simply because, after hundreds of hours of interviews, dozens of searches, and countless returns to the scene at different times of day, no further step led to a new door. Ricky Alvarez was cleared from suspicion. The men standing in the shadows from witness accounts, one by one, didn't match the timeline, the route, or had simply left Stockton long ago. The 3 possible directions from the student ID drop point led to 3 different parts of the city. But every time the investigation team tried to dig deeper in one direction, they only hit dead ends. No one remembered seeing any specific strange vehicle. No cameras. No new physical traces. The faint drag marks on the narrow ground had been erased by rain and time. Any tire tracks that might have had value had been overwritten by hundreds of vehicles coming and going over weeks. Increasingly, what they had felt more like a chain of hypotheses than concrete evidence. On an early winter morning, when the cold began seeping through thick jackets, the lieutenant in charge of the criminal investigation unit called the whole team into the room. He placed Marina's case file, now considerably thicker, in the middle of the table. The familiar names and details appeared on the cover. Marina Soltero, 19 years old, missing since September 1992, Stockton, California. No one needed to reread those lines. They knew them by heart. But there was one thing they had to read, even though no investigator enjoyed it: the new classification code. Marina's case was being moved to the list of open, but no longer actively worked, the polite way of saying what everyone understood as cold case. It didn't mean the file was closed forever. It only meant that, with current resources, there was no reason to believe one more round of interviews, one more search sweep, or a few more shifts staking out the commercial area would make any difference. New cases kept piling up on desks, along with reports needing immediate handling. New victims. New cries for help. Marina, from a name in the center of the whiteboard, became a line in the city's cold case list. In the Stockton PD evidence storage, the bags marked Soltero, Marina. 9 over 1,992 were placed in a clear plastic box, along with evidence from other cases from the same era. The student ID card was kept between 2 thin plastic sheets to prevent further scratches. Copies of the analog camera tape, already photographed and stored on magnetic tape, were placed next to other reels, lying silent in the dark. The procedure was neat, but the feeling in the investigation team was anything but neat. Some younger officers, who had walked dozens of miles around Pacific Avenue in the first weeks, felt like they were being forced to admit defeat. They still clearly remembered the morning the student ID was found by the fence base, that feeling of finally something concrete to hold on to, and now, that evidence lay in a box, separated from them by an entire floor and a heavy metal door. On the rare mornings not pulled into a new case, someone would still casually flip open Marina's file, read a few lines, then set it down with a sigh. But the job didn't wait. A few months later, new faces appeared in the meeting room, new names on the whiteboard, new red dots on the city map. Marina became a name mentioned in a different context. The girl who went missing last year, Still nothing? Nope. Still in the freezer. And then, like most cases, with no body, no arrest, no confession, the story gradually slipped into the gray area between memory and forgetting. Many years passed. The detectives from the first generation who investigated Marina's case transferred units, retired, or moved to other departments. Her file, along with dozens of other unsolved cases, sat in a metal cabinet in a room rarely visited, where the smell of old paper and dust was always present. Occasionally, when a new investigator was assigned to the cold case unit, Marina would resurface not on the main meeting room whiteboard, but on a personal desk, under a desk lamp anchored to a wall corner. The newcomer would flip through the pages: the initial missing person report, transcripts of interviews with the group of teens, sketches of the possible directions, the list of suspects who had been cleared, including Ricky Alvarez with the note, "Not present at scene during determined time frame." Then they would pause longer on the things the previous generation had spent the most time on. Photos from the camera tape. The faint silhouette of a man reflected on the glass door behind Marina. The map, with the 3 routes drawn in red marker. Copies of reports about women being followed around Pacific Avenue in the late 1980s and early 90s. But after a few days, a few weeks of inspiration, no new piece magically appeared to connect those things in a different way. The margin notes from the previous generation of investigators remained exactly right. Unable to identify the man, no specific vehicle reliably linked, unable to determine where Marina was taken after the card drop point. The case remained a beautiful pile of puzzle pieces missing at least one crucial corner piece, so the whole picture could never be complete. What happened to Marina after she stepped into the far dark end of the parking lot? Was she forced into a vehicle there, or led through the narrow path to another point? Was the man in the glass reflection the only one stalking her, or just one of many against the backdrop of a city that always had shadows people avoided looking into? Those questions, over the years, went from daily obsessions to things that occasionally visited the minds of those who had once touched the file, especially on late-night shifts, when they happened to pass the storage room and their eyes lingered on the label Soltero Marina. Missing 9 over 1,992. Some cases go cold because no one remembers them anymore. Marina's was a little different. It was like a glowing ember buried under thick ash. No one touched it for a while, but no investigator dared claim it was completely out. All they could do, over many years, was ensure the file wasn't lost, the evidence wasn't misplaced, so that if one day new technology, a new witness, or some unexpected event blew it back to life, they would still have something to start over with. Until then, the words "cold case" on Marina's file cover remained there, white on a faded brown background, like an ellipsis stretching endlessly in the history of Stockton's missing persons cases. 11 years after Marina vanished, her case was almost only still alive in old folders, scattered conversations among a few veteran investigators, and in the family's memory. If not for a phone call from a neighboring county in early 2003, the name Marina Soltero might very well have continued sliding deeper to the bottom of the cold case list. That day, on a rural road dozens of miles southeast of Stockton, a construction crew was widening the roadway, peeling back old soil layers to reinstall the drainage system. It was the kind of job heavy on machinery and dust. Bulldozers, excavators, huge buckets of earth scooped up from ground that had slept undisturbed for decades. In one deeper than usual scoop, the excavator bucket flung up not just dirt and rocks, but something lighter that tumbled out and rolled to the roadside edge. A worker spotted the dark-colored piece flying off, thought it was trash, walked over to kick it into the waste pile, then stopped. Beneath the dried mud, tangled with torn roots, was a small worn fabric bag, the crossbody kind women often use. The strap was broken, the fabric faded and stiffened by sun and wind. But when he picked it up, it didn't feel like trash someone had tossed a few days ago. Following procedure, the site foreman called the local sheriff's office, because any personal item buried that deep could relate to an old accident or something more serious. At the sheriff's office, when the fabric bag was opened on the table, what remained inside wasn't much. A melted lipstick tube, a plastic comb with most teeth broken, a few rusted coins. And in the smallest pocket, a small metal keychain shaped like a book, scratched, but still legible with the faint engraved words, "The Book Haven, Pacific Ave, Stockton." On the back of the keychain, the initials M.S. were hand-engraved, the kind done at a small mall service kiosk, not industrial printing. No one at the sheriff's office knew the name Marina Soltero, but they knew the Book Haven was an old bookstore in Stockton. The shift supervisor that day, out of professional habit, searched the system for any missing persons or homicide cases involving young women around 1992 to 1993 in Stockton. Marina's name came up almost immediately, tagged with missing, suspicious circumstances, worked at a bookstore on Pacific Avenue. The next phone call went to Stockton PD. When one of the investigators who still remembered Marina's case arrived at the scene to take custody of the fabric bag, he stood by the roadside, looking at the deep gouge the excavator had made, thinking about the distance between this spot and the parking lot behind the bookstore, not just geographically, but intentionally. The bag wasn't on the surface, not carelessly tossed at the roadside. It was buried deep under compacted soil, as if thrown from a moving vehicle on the road at some point years earlier. Then layer upon layer of dust, fallen leaves, mud from rains, minor road repairs piled on top, burying it deeper. The fact that the Bookhaven keychain and the MS initials were in the bag left no doubt about the connection. This was almost certainly the bag Marina carried that night, or at least the one she used in the time before disappearing. The discovery location, many miles from Stockton, wasn't a place she could have accidentally dropped it while wandering the city. If the bag had been found on the roadside near her home, the story might be different, but it appeared on a route Marina had no personal reason to travel herself, let alone leave her belongings there. That pointed to one simple but chilling thing. Someone had taken Marina's bag out of Stockton, far enough to hope that if anyone found it, they wouldn't easily link it to the 1992 disappearance. In the Stockton PD meeting room, the fabric bag and keychain lay on the table next to the photo of the student ID found by the fence 11 years earlier. Two pieces of evidence, two different discovery times, one inside the city, one on the outskirts, forming a diagonal line on the map when marked. The investigator used a marker to connect them, then extended the line northward, toward highways that could lead out of state. There was no hard proof the perpetrator had left California, but Marina's bag appearing many miles from the original scene showed at least one action: erasing traces. Technically, the bag was sent to the lab for fingerprint checks, fiber analysis, any remaining biological traces. But even before results came back, everyone knew the odds were very low. The bag had been in the ground for over a decade, exposed to sun, rain, mud, road oil, and the mechanical impact of machinery. The rough fabric surface had hardened, the inner lining mildewed. Things like fingerprints had long been washed away by early season rains. The results came back as expected. No usable DNA profile, no complete fingerprints, just a few synthetic fibers hard to trace, decomposing plastic bits, and weather-corroded metal. The Bookhaven keychain was confirmed as the type the store sold as a souvenir back then, with no individual serial numbers to trace receipts or buyers. The only thing they gained from the new evidence was confirmation that someone not Marina had taken her bag out of the city to a remote road section and discarded it like trash no one should find. From an investigative psychology standpoint, the 2003 clue was like a light tap on the door. It reminded everyone the case wasn't completely dead, that somewhere out there was a person who had once held Marina's bag after the night she stepped into the darkness behind the Bookhaven. But strategically, it didn't open any new doors. There were no traffic cameras with archives that old to review, no witnesses remembering a vehicle that might have stopped here on a rainy night 10 years prior. The road had been repaved multiple times. The asphalt now was completely new, erasing any old tire marks. In the end, the fabric bag and keychain were added to Marina's evidence box, with a new layer of notes in the file. Evidence discovered 2003 X miles southeast of Stockton. Confirmed belonging to victim. No usable forensic data obtained. It didn't answer where Marina had been, what vehicle she got into, who she encountered along that route, It just added another comma to the unfinished story, then returned the case to its place, a cold case suspended between what people knew for sure and what time had almost completely erased. The clue about the canvas bag being tossed onto a road many miles from Stockton led investigators back to a hypothesis they had mentioned before but never fully pursued. Marina could not have vanished from downtown and had her belongings appear in the countryside without some means of transportation taking her out of there. The images in their minds, the sound of a car door slamming shut that a young man had once mentioned, the student ID card falling off her usual route, the bag being thrown from a vehicle on a deserted stretch, all revolved around something invisible that everyone sensed, but no one had clearly seen: a vehicle. When Marina's cold case was briefly reopened after the 2003 discovery, one of the first things they did was go back to the old witnesses, people who had lived and worked around Pacific Avenue in the early 90s. More than 10 years had passed, but sometimes details only truly surface when the initial fear has faded and people have enough distance to look back. In those conversations, a pattern emerged. Multiple people mentioned a light gray van that had repeatedly appeared around the commercial area. A sales clerk at a laundromat said she remembered an old van, no logo on it, often parked right up against the back wall, near the auxiliary lot. A delivery worker said he often had to maneuver around it when bringing goods to the back doors of stores. It would park diagonally, blocking the way. It was always that same gray vehicle. An elderly woman living in the apartment complex across the street said that when taking out the trash in the evening, she would often see a gray van parked at the end of the lot, lights off, no one coming or going, as if the driver was just sitting waiting in the dark. No one remembered the license plate. Some even argued about the make. Some said Dodge, others Ford, and some only recalled the 7-seater kind, boxy. But the fact that a vehicle in the gray zone, both literally and figuratively, had repeatedly appeared around the parking area behind the Brookhaven, was enough for the investigation team to decide if there was a vehicle that took Marina away, it was very likely not completely unfamiliar to this area. They requested the DMV to provide a list of gray vans registered in and around Stockton during the period from 1991 to 1993, focusing on the common models of that era: Dodge Caravan, Ford Aerostar, Chevy Astro. The return data table was dozens of pages long, hundreds of license plates, owner names, registration addresses, inspection dates, current status. On paper, each name was a possibility. In reality, they knew they would not have enough resources to knock on every door. They had to filter. They crossed out vehicles registered in areas too far from Pacific Avenue, vehicles belonging to companies with clear logos, vehicles whose usage hours overlapped with daytime work shifts without staying overnight. They kept the personal vehicles registered to people living within a few-mile radius of the commercial area, paying special attention to addresses near the 3 possible directions they had mapped out from the student ID card. Gradually, from a massive sea of data, the list narrowed down to about a few dozen. Among those names, one stood out more than the rest. A late 1980s gray van, registered to a man living on a small street near the very stretch of road where Marina's canvas bag had been found in 2003. The owner was a middle-aged man, a freelance repairman, who frequently traveled between Stockton and nearby towns for work. The vehicle was noted as the type often used to haul tools, no company logo, exactly the unnoticeable vehicle that witnesses tended to describe. On paper, everything was almost perfect. This man lived a short distance from where the bag was tossed, owned an unmarked gray van, and had a job that made driving in and out of the commercial area routine. When the cold case team looked at that name, many felt the same sensation they had once had with Ricky. This could be the missing link they had been waiting for. They immediately pulled the man's file, let's call him Henry Lowe, from the system. No criminal record, a few minor traffic tickets. A couple of times police were called because he parked blocking delivery access. Neighbors described Henry as the quiet type, not very social, lived mostly on the road rather than at home. When invited in to answer some questions, Henry appeared surprised but cooperative. He confirmed having worked in the Pacific Avenue commercial area in the early 90s, saying he had taken a few jobs repairing air conditioning and equipment for some stores in that block. When asked if he remembered the disappearance of a girl who worked at the bookstore, he shook his head, saying, "I go through a lot of places. I don't pay attention to everyone's names." In the eyes of investigators who had once been burned with Ricky, that indifference was both suspicious and understandable. They did not rush to push Henry into the role of prime suspect. Instead, they went around it, checking old work logs, invoices, anything that showed where Henry had been in September 1992, the time Marina vanished. Surprisingly, this time the logistics of a repairman's life saved him. A large invoice for repairing the refrigeration system at a warehouse in Sacramento clearly noted the date and time, with the warehouse manager's confirming signature overlapping with the period when Marina got off work. The manager, though retired, was still alive, and vaguely remembered the air conditioning repair guy with the gray van being there all evening, not finishing until late at night. A timesheet from the warehouse confirmed this. Henry had signed out when leaving there at a time, hours after Marina had already gone missing. Additionally, the limited but still existing data from a gas station near Sacramento showed Henry's payment card being used there that night, far enough from Stockton that there was no way he could have driven back and forth between the two places in the short time frame. The investigators, once again, saw the red arrow they had drawn on the whiteboard hit a dead end. Henry fit the picture of the man driving a gray van lurking around the commercial area on many levels, but at the most critical point, the moment Marina vanished, he was not there. When they informed him that he had been cleared of suspicion, Henry just shrugged and said, "I told you, my vehicle is ugly, but I didn't kidnap anyone." On the surface, the story ended there. Henry Lowe's file received the note checked solid alibi evidence. His gray van disappeared from the whiteboard, making room for other notes. But for the cold case team, this investigation left two contrasting feelings. On one hand, eliminating Henry reinforced their belief that they were not ready to jump on any hypothesis just because it made sense while ignoring objective data. On the other hand, for the second time in the life of one case, they found themselves spending days, weeks, chasing a vehicle that seemed almost right, but ultimately was wrong. What remained after the investigation into Henry's van was not a new suspect, but a harsh confirmation. The gray van that witnesses remembered was not something that could be easily traced with a few DMV lookups. It could be a vehicle that had been sold, scrapped, crushed. It could have changed owners, changed plates, or been registered in a different county. It could belong to someone living outside the official systems, someone who left no paper trail except tire marks on the asphalt that night. When they put the long list of license plates back into the folder, the lead investigator added a brief line in the summary notes. Gray van remains likely the primary vehicle, but none yet reliably linked to the victim. Need a clue beyond DMV. That was a subtle way of acknowledging a simple truth. To decode the vehicle that took Marina away from Stockton, they would need something more than a list of license plates. They needed a mistake, a piece of paper misfiled, a detail accidentally overlooked somewhere in the dusty file storage. Something that, at that time, they had no idea actually existed. 26 years after the night Marina vanished, the cold, forgotten storage room of Stockton PD was finally dragged out of its prehistoric state. In 2018, the department received funding to modernize the entire archiving system, especially the cold cases, the old metal cabinets, the clear plastic boxes labeled with marker pens, the magnetic tapes, the stacks of tea-stained paper reports. Everything was gradually moved into a new room where high-capacity scanners, servers, and case management software were waiting. To many people, it was just a dry digitize the paperwork project, but to the investigators who had been on the job long enough, they knew this was a second chance for cases once thought to be quietly laid to rest. The idea was simple. Once everything was in the system, they could use keywords, timelines, geographic areas to uncover connections that the human eye in 1992 could not see, or that had been buried under layers of overlapping files. Marina Soltero was one of the first names flagged for full scan, not just the main reports, but the appendices, notes, parking tickets, witness lists, every smallest scrap of paper that might be related. A small team, including some young officers fresh on the job, and a few veteran detectives who had once touched the Marina case, spent weeks sitting at the scanners, turning each page, checking each line of metadata on the screen. During the process, a clear rule was set. Any document of unclear origin, not definitely belonging to any file, but with similar time and location markers, had to be scanned and flagged needs re-review. One afternoon, as the last sunlight of the day slanted through the small window of the digitization room, one of the younger officers, his eyes already tired from hours of nothing but faded reports on car thefts and bar fights, pulled from an old box a stack of files related to illegal parking. It was the kind of file no one paid much attention to. Tickets stuck on windshields, receipts, a few hurried lines of handwriting. He flipped through the pages, intending to scan them into the general folder, when his eyes stopped on the handwritten address line on a yellowed ticket. Rear parking lot, Pacific Ave commercial strip behind bookstore, laundromat. The note below, scribbled by the issuing officer, gray van, no business signage, parked blocking service lane. The date on the ticket was September 1992. He frowned. September 1992, Pacific Avenue, the parking lot behind the row of stores. A gray van with no logo. Those three details were no longer just harmless words. He set the ticket aside, pulled up the cold case list on the screen, and typed the keywords Pacific Ave, 1992. The name Soltero, Marina, missing, popped up almost immediately. A chill ran down his spine. Following procedure, he reported it to the detective in charge of the cold case unit. The two of them sat together at the computer, staring at the freshly scanned ticket on the screen. The old Stockton PD logo in the top corner, the location description in the middle, and at the bottom the license plate section. Vehicle type, officer's signature. The plate was written a bit sloppily, but legible enough. Vehicle type, Dodge Caravan. Gray. The owner's name, in the left corner, was printed in capital letters. Paul Devereux. On the edge of the paper was an old crease, as if the ticket had been hurriedly stuffed into some other file and then forgotten. When they checked the faint file code number in the corner, they understood why. This ticket, through a very human error, had been misfiled into a different case, a complaint about parking, blocking delivery access from the same period, and from there, it had drifted along with the paperwork, never making it into the pile of documents the Marina investigation team reviewed in 1992. It had been right there, in the same storage room, for more than 2 decades, just in the wrong folder. The veteran detective sat silent for a few seconds, then turned back to the original stack, quickly flipping through the remaining pages. There were no other tickets from that time period, noting rear parking lot Pacific Ave, near bookstore. No other gray van recorded in that exact spot. The name Paul Devereux had never appeared in any report or interview transcript from the Marina case. What did that mean? Very likely, while the investigation team was scouring DMV lists and asking around about gray vans, they had no idea that their own system had once recorded exactly such a van, belonging to a specific person, ticketed for parking in the lot directly behind the Bookhaven while Marina was still alive. They entered the license plate from the ticket into the new DMV system. The record popped up almost instantly. Paul Devereux, residing at an address in Stockton in the early 90s, registered owner of a late 1980s gray Dodge Caravan. After 1994, the registration address moved to a small nearby town. Later, the vehicle was transferred, then removed from the system when it reached the end of its service life. In the notes, there were still a few lines about one time Paul had been ticketed for blocking delivery access, also near the Pacific Avenue area. At this point, the name was no longer just a meaningless string of letters. It was a gap in the entire original investigation. If that ticket had not been misfiled, if Paul Devereux's name had been added to the list of gray van owners known to be in the back lot at exactly that time, the investigative lens might have turned toward him much sooner. But history does not follow what-ifs. It follows small mistakes. Pieces of paper slipped into the wrong folder. Finding the ticket did not immediately turn Paul into the perpetrator, but it did something no one in the previous 2 decades of storage had managed. For the first time, there was a documented, objective link between a gray van, the parking lot behind Pacific Avenue, and a specific name during the period Marina was still alive. On the computer screen, the detective zoomed in on the issuing officer's signature, rereading the description, "Parked blocking rear service lane, asked to move." If that officer still remembered, if he could recount how he spoke to the driver, what the face looked like, whether anyone else was with him, all of that would be gold. In the corner of the room, the scanner kept swallowing old pages, turning them into PDF files in the system. But for the people sitting in front of the screen, the world suddenly narrowed to a single, thin, stained, faded sheet of paper bearing a name they had never heard before. Next to the folder, Soltero, Marina, missing 1992. A new folder was created in the system named Devereaux Paul, related to Pacific Ave parking lot 9/1992. With just one scan, one click, Marina's cold case for the first time in many years gained a new character stepping onto the stage, not from the hazy memory of a witness or an investigator's guess, but from the very words their own system had recorded from the beginning, only now finally seen by someone. The discovery of the parking ticket in Paul Devereaux's name made the entire cold case team look back at everything they had about the area behind the Brookhaven with different eyes. If in 1992 they had done everything possible with pen and paper, maps, and flickering analog videotapes, then in 2018, circling a name on a parking ticket was no longer an endpoint, but a starting point. While one group began digging deep into Paul's background, old addresses, occupation, any interactions with the legal system, the other group turned back to the silent witness of that night, the surveillance tape from the back door of the bookstore. A digital copy had been made years earlier, but only at the level of capturing whatever the analog tape could show. This time, they decided to try something new, sending the entire original video file to a technical support unit specializing in image restoration, where modern algorithms, what the press often called AI video enhancement, were used to clarify what the human eye in 1992 could not read. A few weeks later, they received back a hard drive along with a thick technical report. In the opening lines, the report listed all the limitations: original resolution too low, magnetic tape noise, lack of lighting, narrow camera angle. But further down, the dry tone of the technician began to shift. Successfully extracted several intermediate frames using motion interpolation techniques, reduced spatial noise and increased contrast in dark regions, detected several details previously difficult to identify. In short, no miracles, but something new. They pulled their chairs closer to the screen, dimmed the lights as they had done many times before, and played the processed video. This time, the familiar footage suddenly felt unfamiliar. Marina stepped out the back door of the Brookhaven, her figure still shrouded in the characteristic gray patches of the old camera, but the outlines sharper, her shadow on the brick pavement a little more defined. When she paused and turned her head toward the dark area, the detail that had haunted them for years, something else happened. Instead of just a vague dark patch on the glass door behind her, the reflection now had enough contrast to better separate foreground and background. The technicians at the support unit had done what no one in 1992 had thought of. They did not just brighten everything uniformly, but used algorithms to learn how to separate light from inside the store and from outside, then reconstruct the edges of moving objects based on tiny changes in the noise pattern. The result was that on the right edge of the frame where before there had only been an indistinct blurry shadow, the shape of a human arm and hand now appeared more clearly in the reflection on the glass. In motion, the system had generated 12 new intermediate frames between the original ones, compensating for the jumps the old camera skipped, making the movement appear smoother. And it was in those added frames that something they had never seen before emerged. The hand, positioned closer to the door frame, with fingers partially extended, palm facing inward, like the motion of someone reaching out and then pulling back, or having just touched something outside the camera's view. The detective paused the video, rewound and replayed those seconds, zoomed in on the reflected area on the glass. Though the image was still grainy, they could now count the fingers, distinguish the wrist, even spot a watch band or leather strap there. An in-house technician was called in to help, using specialized software to outline edges, measure proportions, Compare the hand's position across frames. While zooming in and further clarifying the reflected wrist area, another detail emerged. On the back of the hand, running from the base of the thumb to the middle of the hand, there was an unusual bright streak, not from lighting, because it did not shift with the angle, but followed the hand's movement as part of the skin. Under different filter layers, the streak appeared as a rough, lighter-colored line compared to the surrounding skin. When they added a bit more contrast and inverted the colors, it took on the shape almost like a capital letter, an angular block that looked very much like a tilted R. The room fell silent for a few seconds. One detective blurted out, "Looks like a scar shaped like an R." Another cautioned, "Or just a coincidence in the pattern." None of them were dermatology experts. They knew to be careful with the human tendency to see familiar shapes in blurry spots. But the fact that the bright streak maintained a stable shape across multiple frames when the hand rotated slightly, when the wrist changed angle a little, suggested this was not just random noise. They sent those frames back to the external technical unit once more, with the request, "Assess whether this could be a scar, tattoo, or merely an artifact from processing." The response report a few days later was technical, but the conclusion was enough to make their hearts beat faster. Cannot conclusively determine specific shape, letter, or symbol, but high probability this is an anomaly on the skin surface, possibly a long scar or faded tattoo. In other words, the hand in that reflection was not a clean hand, it bore an identifying mark. When they placed the newly printed frames next to the parking ticket bearing Paul Devereaux's name, the story suddenly gained another layer. If Paul was the owner of the gray van ticketed in the lot behind the Brookhaven in September 1992, and if the man standing in the darkness that night was the driver of that van, then the detail of the hand, with an unusual mark, became something to verify immediately. They began searching for any information on Paul's physical characteristics. Old driver's license photos, employee ID photos if any existed, medical records if the court allowed access. An old black and white photo from the 90s, in another administrative file, showed a man of average build, short cropped hair, looking straight at the camera, hands not clearly visible. But deeper in the digitized records, they found a document that seemed innocuous, a medical report from a small emergency room where Paul had once been treated for stitches on the back of his left hand after a minor work accident. The report noted, laceration dorsum, left hand, approx. 4 centimeters, needing X stitches, shape irregular, possible long-term scarring. No one had written scar shaped like an R in the record, but for those who had seen the reflected image on the tape, knowing that Paul had a long scar on the back of his left hand made it hard to dismiss this coincidence as random. In the meeting room, the printed frames from the video were taped next to an enlarged photocopy of the relevant medical report section. Below them, someone wrote in red marker, "Hand in reflection. Shows mark in position matching injury recorded in Paul D.'s file." From a vague, shadowy figure on glass, they now had gender, standing position, distance from marina, hand movement, and a possibility not yet proven, but strong enough to ignore no longer of a personal identifying mark. The new frames had, quite literally, let them see more from an old story. The old suspicion about the man in the dark corner was reignited, this time not just as a ghost in witness accounts, but as an image they could hold, point to, cross-reference. And the name Paul Devereaux, from being just a line on a parking ticket, began to take center stage on the whiteboard of the Marina Soltero case. When the name Paul Devereaux was no longer just on a parking ticket but standing next to the video frames and a medical record with a scar in the matching location, the cold case team knew it was time to turn this man's past inside out. They started with the most obvious thing: addresses. In the old DMV data, Paul had been registered as living in a small apartment on a street only a few blocks from Pacific Avenue, close enough to walk to the commercial area in a matter of minutes. The map showed that from the door of that apartment, he only had to cross 2 intersections and walk down one side street to reach the parking lot behind the Brookhaven. In other words, the lot where Marina vanished was not just a place Paul parked randomly once and got ticketed. It was within his daily living radius. They went to the old building, now under new ownership, but information about tenants from more than 20 years ago was still in a dusty file cabinet in the management office. The new owner, an older man who had just taken over the property from his father, dug through the ledgers and confirmed. Yeah, that name sounds familiar. He rented a second-floor unit, stayed there about 2 years, then left pretty suddenly. When asked about his personality, he shrugged. Quiet, paid on time, handled his own stuff. No noise complaints. But he wasn't sociable either. Neighbors griped that he would often stand on the balcony late at night, staring down at the street, like he wasn't just looking at the moon. The old neighbors, those still around, shared scattered fragments. A woman from the same floor remembered seeing Paul come home very late, usually after the stores had closed, when the commercial parking lots only had a few cars left. Once, while taking out the trash, she caught him standing at the corner of the auxiliary lot behind the building, hands in pockets, eyes fixed toward Pacific Avenue as if waiting for something. When she said hello, he just nodded and turned away. Nothing clear enough to call the police about, but enough to make her uneasy. In the DMV records, the 1989 gray Dodge Caravan appeared as a supporting character tightly tied to Paul. The vehicle had been registered about a year before Marina's disappearance. Purpose of use: personal, small business. When they checked old repair invoices from Stockton garages, a few shops confirmed working on that vehicle. Brake pads replaced, sliding side door adjusted, rear lighting system fixed. One older mechanic recalled, "The right sliding door was always sticking, you had to yank it hard to close. I told him to replace the whole assembly, but he was cheap, just said make it work for now." That detail made the investigators take note. A door that was hard to close could produce a sound someone might remember, like a heavy thud on a quiet night. They went back to the old reports of women being followed around Pacific Avenue that had been marked on their map. One by one, they cross-referenced the timing of those reports with the period Paul was registered living at the nearby apartment, with the point he started owning the gray van. A pattern began to emerge. At least 3 of the 4 reports about a strange man following women toward the auxiliary lot, or the alley behind, fell within the 2 years Paul lived in the area. In a 1991 report, a young woman walking home from the bus stop said she felt a van following her at an unusually slow speed, almost creeping, then stopping when she turned onto another street. She only remembered it as a dirty gray van, no logos, rear windows kind of tinted. At the time, police took the report, but could not trace a plate. Now, placing that report next to Paul's Dodge Caravan parking ticket, it was hard to believe it was just coincidence. They kept searching the system for calls, reporting suspicious behavior involving men following women within a few-mile radius of Paul's address. Some calls did not name the suspect, but described a white male, 30 to 40 years old, average build, short hair, quiet. One woman who worked the evening shift at a convenience store remembered calling police in 1992 because a guy kept standing in the parking lot staring in, but never came inside to buy anything, waiting for the girls to come out, then pretending to ask for directions. When asked, she could not be sure it was Paul, but when shown an old photo of him, she hesitated. Maybe, I'm not positive, but something looks familiar. Still, all of this from Paul's apartment location, the gray van, the faint appearances in other people's memories, was only pieces forming a pattern, not enough to make him an official suspect in the eyes of the law. Prosecutors would need more. The investigators understood that. But they also knew one thing. Men who like standing in the dark watching others are rarely completely harmless, especially when someone has vanished around them. They dug deeper. What did Paul do for a living? Tax records showed he did technical labor, odd jobs, air conditioning repair, electrical work, carpet replacement, jobs taken by word of mouth. This explained why his van was often seen around various commercial and apartment areas he needed it to haul tools. But it also meant he had a legitimate reason to be in every back corner of buildings, places only employees and delivery people normally accessed. When they checked his address history, another detail caught their attention. Paul left the apartment near Pacific Avenue just a few months after Marina's disappearance. He moved out of Stockton to a small town more than an hour's drive away, and never registered residence within city limits again. On paper, This could be a normal move: new job, cheaper rent, family, any reason. But in the investigator's eyes, the fact that a man ticketed for parking in the exact lot behind where a girl vanished, who lived nearby, owned an unmarked gray van, appeared vaguely in some reports of following women, and then left coincidentally right after the disappearance made big news, was too much of a luxury to ignore. They also accessed the tip line archives, where anonymous calls, handwritten letters, emails with tips were stored to see if Paul's name or his van ever came up. No call named him directly, but one handwritten letter sent in mid-1993, unsigned, made them pause. The letter described a guy who always hangs around the back parking lot with a dirty van, someone the writer felt had issues with women, and suggested police keep an eye on him before something happens. At the time, the letter was filed with dozens of other vague tips, no one connecting it to Marina because it did not mention the victim. But now, looking at the receipt date just months after Marina's disappearance and cross-referencing the description, the suspicion around Paul grew thicker. Still, throughout all this, the justice system had not officially touched him. No arrest warrant, no charges, no conviction. Paul Devereaux, on paper, remained a citizen, with no criminal record. The investigators had to accept this uncomfortable truth as they prepared to move to the next phase. If they wanted to pull him out of the shadows of the files, turn him from interesting name into suspect in a missing person case, they would need a clear legal reason to knock on his door again. And this time, the questions would not just be about blocking the service lane behind a bookstore in 1992. The information about Paul Devereaux, about the gray van, the parking ticket, the scar on the back of his hand, all of it was enough to turn him into the name circled in red on the whiteboard, but it still had not crossed the biggest barrier. It was only circumstantial pieces, with no one stepping forward to say that Paul had ever said or done anything directly tied to a girl disappearing in Stockton. What they needed was an insider account, some voice, however late, saying that Paul was not just randomly appearing around Pacific Avenue. That, surprisingly, came from a hospital bed more than 100 miles from Stockton, nearly 30 years after the night Marina Soltero stepped into the darkness behind the Bookhaven. In 2021, a young investigator on the cold case team received a forwarded email from the tip intake department of a neighboring county. The subject line sounded like hundreds of others. Tip related to old case, Stockton 1992. The content was written by a nurse providing end-of-life care at a small hospital. She said that an elderly man, in his final days battling illness, had repeatedly mentioned to her an old matter in Stockton that he should have told the police long ago. This man, reported with his real name but temporarily referred to by the investigation team as Witness A, was not a priest, not an acquaintance of the victim. He was simply someone who had lived in Stockton in the early 90s, then moved away, carrying secrets he had never fully shared with anyone. During a night shift, Witness A told the nurse, his voice breaking from pain medication, "I've been silent too long. There's something about my old buddy, Paul Devereaux. He always said he regretted something in Stockton, something with a girl, in the parking lot behind those stores." At first, the nurse thought it was just hazy memories from an old man, but when he repeated the name Devereaux several times, mentioned Stockton, 92 or 93 something, the girl who worked at the bookstore disappeared, she decided to report it. She was not originally from Stockton, but she knew enough to search online. The first result when she typed Stockton missing girl 1992 bookstore Pacific was an old article about the Marina Soltero case. The chill down her spine made her immediately email the police, including the hospital phone number and suggesting, "If you think this case is still open, maybe you should talk to him soon, before it's too late." A group of investigators hit the road right away. They did not know if they would meet someone speaking coherently or a mind confused by medication. When they entered the room, they saw Witness A. Gaunt body, pale skin, thin arms, reduced to skin over bone, but his eyes were still sharp, still recognizing who they were. After being explained his rights and that the conversation would be recorded, he nodded and said in a raspy voice, "I'm not sure how much longer I'll be here, so if you want to hear it now." In the fragmented story, pieced together with gentle questions, Part of the past began to emerge. Witness A said he had worked with Paul Devereaux on a few small repair jobs around Stockton in the late 80s and early 90s. They were not close friends. Just two guys who sometimes shared a truck, a toolbox, and a few beers after work. He remembered Paul as quiet, but whenever he drank enough, he had a strange way of philosophizing about opportunities, about how life gives you moments when no one notices what you're doing. There was one time, and this was the part he had repeated to the nurse, then to the investigators in a small bar near Pacific Avenue. Paul said something he could never forget. It was after Marina's disappearance, when local news was still covering the case. Witness A recounted. He looked up at the TV, where they were showing the girl's picture again, then said quietly, "Shouldn't have left that girl there alone. I shouldn't have stopped that night." At the time, he did not probe deeper, thinking Paul was just speaking generally like everyone else. But a few months later, when Paul was preparing to leave Stockton, the two sat behind the truck, drinking beer, and he suddenly dropped another line, eyes not on him but on a parking lot behind a row of stores. "Do you believe one dumb decision in a dark parking lot is enough to ruin a person's whole life? I think about that night all the time." Behind that bookstore, Witness A followed his gaze and realized it was the commercial area where Marina worked. "I did something there that I wish I'd never done," Paul said, then gave a faint laugh, finished his beer, and said no more. When the Marina case faded from the news, Witness A pushed it aside, reassuring himself that Paul was probably just talking about an affair or some personal trouble. He did not want to believe his drinking buddy could be involved with a missing girl. But in the years that followed, every time he accidentally heard about Marina, or saw her name again in a cold case article, the words "that night behind the bookstore" haunted him. On the hospital bed, Witness A told the investigators, eyes tearing up, "I'm not saying I heard him confess to murder. He didn't say, 'I killed her.' But he hinted so much that, looking back now, I feel like I didn't do the right thing. I stayed silent when I should have called you guys more than 20 years ago." The investigators asked if Paul had ever mentioned Marina by name. Witness A shook his head. He didn't say the name. He just said, "that girl," in the way everyone knew who he was talking about. The whole town was only talking about one girl back then. When asked how Paul expressed his regret, Witness A recounted that in one rare moment, seeing Paul disturbed, he had watched him stare at his left hand, where the long scar was, then say, "Every time I look at it, I remember that night. Remember not stopping in time." That statement, when cross-referenced with the video frame showing the hand with the R-shaped scar, made the air in the hospital room grow heavy. What Witness A said was not a direct confession. It was a series of hesitant, bitter remarks from someone carrying memories of another person's guilt. But in the eyes of the law, it was the kind of indirect statement that could help strengthen the investigative pattern. Paul was not just present in the area, he carried guilt tied to one night in the parking lot behind the bookstore. The investigators, following procedure, asked Witness A why he waited until 2021 to speak. The old man coughed, then said, "Because I was a coward. Because back then I thought if I wasn't 100% sure, it was better not to bother anyone. But then I had daughters, granddaughters, and every time I looked at them, I thought about that night. Now, I'm about to go. I don't want to take this secret to the grave." The bedside statement was audio recorded, video recorded, signed and confirmed by witnesses and the nurse present. When the cold case team brought that file back to the meeting room and played it for the whole group, many felt like they were hearing someone pull back the curtain just a little more, letting light into a room that had been dark too long. It did not provide all the answers, but it placed Paul Devereaux exactly where the physical evidence had always pointed. A man present at the right time, the right place, with the right kind of vehicle, bearing a scar in the right spot, and in the years afterward, always talking about an old matter in Stockton in the language only those living with the shadow of guilt would use. From that moment, the Marina Soltero case was no longer simply the story of an anonymous dark figure on glass. It became the story of a flesh-and-blood man, with a name, addresses, a past, and a psychological shadow that had finally been exposed from the hospital bed of someone who knew too much, too late. The investigation accelerated, no longer in wait for clues mode, but shifting to We're being chased by time, again, but this time, the time was not the first 4 months after Marina vanished, but the final years. Paul Devereaux might still be lucid enough to answer the questions that should have been asked long, long before. The bedside statement in 2021 was like pouring gasoline on the glowing embers that the cold case team had kept smoldering for the past several years. With witness A, with a 1992 parking ticket, with a scar on the back of the hand in the AI-enhanced video segment, the investigators finally had enough to convince the prosecutor to obtain a search warrant for Paul Devereaux's current home in Lodi, a quiet town not far from Stockton by car, where he had lived quietly for many years, almost blending into the community background. The small single-story house, pale painted walls, neatly mowed front lawn, nothing different from dozens of others on the same street. Neighbors described Paul, now an elderly man, as quiet, polite, minds his own business, occasionally driving an old pickup for odd jobs, coming home on time, rarely having visitors. No one imagined that a 30-year-old cold case revolved around that name. The morning the investigation team knocked on the door, Paul opened it with more confusion than panic. He looked at the search warrant and asked briefly, "The old Stockton thing?" When explained that this was part of a reopened investigation, he did not argue, just stepped aside to let them in, without inviting anyone to sit or offering coffee. That attitude, neither resistant nor cooperative, was something investigators were familiar with when dealing with people carrying long-held secrets. The warrant covered the house, garage, porch, any storage space. One team started with the obvious: papers, old boxes, closets, shed. They found a few things that caught attention: a box of old newspapers about unsolved crimes, some clippings from local papers about missing women, but nothing directly mentioning Marina. That could just be an obsession with crime that many people have. Another team, based on experience, started looking upward. The ceiling. In houses like this, between the roof and the ceiling there is often a small space, an attic or technical crawl space, where homeowners rarely go, but a favorite spot for those wanting to hide something from daily view. In the narrow hallway leading to the bedroom, an officer noticed a gypsum ceiling panel with a faint cut line, the cut repainted over but not perfectly matching the rest. He got a folding ladder and pulled the panel down. The smell of dust, dry wood, and insulation fibers wafted out. He shone a flashlight up, saw wiring running, beams, and a white nylon bag stuffed deep into the corner, partially covered by insulation batting. The bag was carefully pulled down and placed on a sheet spread on the floor. The lead investigator personally put on gloves and untied the knot hardened by time. The rustling sound of nylon echoed in the silent house, loud enough to hear the wall clock ticking in the living room. Inside, it was not meaningless trash. First was an old women's wallet, leather peeling, the long type women often keep in purses. When opened, what fell out onto the table made the whole room hold its breath. A Delta College student ID in the name of Marina Soltero, the photo, the young face of her, not the plastic card picked up by the fence in 1992. But another one, older. Next to it, a library card with her handwritten signature. Next was a thin silver bracelet, small star-shaped charm, the back engraved with the initials M.S., exactly matching the bracelet that appeared in a family photo. Marina's mother had once given police years earlier, when describing her daughter. She never took this off. She said it was her high school graduation gift. In the bag, there was also a white plastic name badge with the Brookhaven logo and the faded letters Marina, Clerk, the back still with its pin. These items could not be something casually picked up from any trash bin. They were personal possessions tied to Marina's identity, her job, gone missing right after her shift at that very bookstore. They were not in the original case evidence log, meaning they had never been collected at the scene. The investigator looked at each item, recalling old notes. Family reported unable to find bracelet, wallet, and badge in Marina's room after disappearance. Those 3 items had been noted as missing items, possibly taken with victim. Now they were in a nylon bag hidden in the ceiling of a man who once lived near where Marina worked, once owned the gray van ticketed behind the bookstore, had a scar matching the position of the hand in the video, and had been recounted by an old friend as having regretted an old matter in the parking lot behind the bookstore. They called a forensic team to process the scene immediately. The nylon bag was resealed, each item inside photographed and numbered. The surfaces of the wallet, badge, bracelet were checked for DNA and potential fingerprints under lab conditions. Though the chances of recovering traces after so many years were low, the investigators knew they did not necessarily need Paul's fingerprints on Marina's items to make this heavy evidence. The fact that those items were in his ceiling, hidden in a nylon bag, was already a huge question. When asked to explain, Paul looked at the bag of items from a few meters away, then turned his face. At first he said he didn't know what the bag was, but property records showed he was the first owner after the house was built. No prior residents. After a few minutes of silence, he changed his story, saying he might have found the wallet and a few items in a dumpster behind the commercial area years ago, kept them because he thought he'd return them to someone someday, then forgot. The explanation sounded flimsy on its face, but when cross-checked with reality, he never contacted police, never returned them to the family, chose to hide them in the ceiling instead of throwing them away. It almost completely collapsed. The investigator asked, "Why hide them in the ceiling, in a tightly knotted nylon bag, if you just found a few items?" Paul did not answer. He requested a lawyer. The interview stopped there, but that silence spoke as much as any confession would. In the station meeting room, the nylon bag from the ceiling was placed next to the old evidence. The student ID picked up by the fence in 1992, stills from the backdoor video, the parking ticket, photocopy of the medical record about the hand scar, transcript of the bedside statement. For the first time in the history of the Marina Soltero case, they had a direct, concrete, physical link between the victim and the man every other thread had pointed to. No longer just he was there. He had a gray van. He said strange things about one night in the lot. Now it was the girl's belongings found in the most private, hidden space of his home, many years after she vanished. This was no longer an intuitive suspicion. It was evidence any jury would have to look at, hold, weigh. The discovery of the nylon bag in the ceiling did not answer every question. It did not reveal where Marina went after leaving the lot, exactly what happened to her, where her body is, but it did one crucial thing. It completely shattered any story Paul might have used to stay outside suspicion. From that moment, in the files, in the investigator's eyes, in the prosecutor's mind, Paul Devereaux was no longer one suspicious man among many suspicious men. He became the center of a 3-decade missing person case, and the dusty nylon bag pulled down from the ceiling in Lodi was the turning point that brought the Marina case out of the fog of hypotheses into the cold, sharp light of evidence. Pulling the nylon bag down from the ceiling was enough for the investigation team to feel they were on a completely different level of the case, but the house in Lodi still had a few more secrets unwilling to reveal themselves. When the search team moved to the garage where Paul stored all sorts of tools, toolboxes, old cardboard boxes, everything at first looked just like any garage belonging to an older repairman. Tangled electrical wires, dried paint cans, drills, screw boxes. But in a deep corner, on a high wooden shelf, was a faded shoebox, lid sealed with old yellow tape. They brought it down, opened it, expecting miscellaneous junk, and found inside a jumble of keepsakes, old baseball tickets, store receipts, a few faded photos, and at the bottom, a Kodak 35mm film canister, familiar black and yellow plastic shell, still with the 200 ASA label and handwritten scribble on the case in ballpoint pen. Sep 92. P. Ave. The gloved hand paused longer on the film canister. September 1992. Pacific Avenue. That was exactly the time frame and location of the Marina case. The film canister was not in the old evidence list, meaning it had never been seized from anywhere related to her. The investigator immediately sealed the film canister and sent it to the lab specializing in processing old film. The mere existence of the film here, in a shoebox on Paul's garage shelf, was already strange, but only when it was developed did they understand its full importance. Developing a film roll more than 20 years old was not simple. The technicians had to adjust chemicals, temperature, extend processing time to try to salvage as many frames as possible. Part of the film had suffered moisture damage, some sections stuck together, but they still separated most of the strip, hung it to dry, then scanned each frame digitally. At first, the photos appearing on the computer screen were harmless. A few shots of Stockton streets in daylight, Pacific Avenue with the Brookhaven sign in the distant background, a corner of a coffee shop, a few young friends' faces smiling at the lens. In a few frames, they saw Marina's figure exactly the face from the student ID photo, but more alive, hair loose, holding a coffee cup, making a playful grimace at someone. It seemed like this was a roll from a simple camera that Marina or her friends had carried, taking casual shots around the work area in those late summer, early fall days that year. And then, about midway through the roll, the technician paused, zoomed in on one frame. The photo was slightly blurry from camera shake, but the composition was clear. The parking lot behind the row of stores on Pacific Avenue, exactly the kind of backdrop investigators had drawn until their markers ran dry on the whiteboard. In the middle of the frame, Marina stood slightly off to one side, turning her head toward the camera, eyes squinting from the light, half smiling, half surprised, as if unsure she wanted to be photographed right then. Behind her, just a few steps away, was a gray van parked close to the brick wall, the common Dodge family van type from that era. No company logo, no decals, just a plain light-colored boxy metal shape. The sliding side door was closed, but the front window seemed slightly open. Most notable of all was the right edge of the frame, where the photographer had not fully centered. Part of a man's body caught in the shot. The figure was only a shadow, because light and handshake blurred the details. Only the upper half visible, shoulders, part of the head, and the left arm hanging down. But when zoomed in, contrast increased. Using the same techniques applied to the backdoor video, the outlines became clearer. Average build, not too tall, not too short, level shoulders, short haircut, thin jacket, the left hand, with an uneven bright area on the back again, the long bright streak that the investigators' eyes had grown accustomed to recognizing as the sign of a scar. The photo was not clear enough to confirm this was a sharp-faced portrait of Paul in 1992, but it accomplished three important things. First, it confirmed Marina had once stood very close to an unmarked gray van in the exact back parking lot, in an everyday context, while she was still alive, and at least not yet sensing danger, because her expression in the photo showed no fear, only slight shyness. Second, it showed a man was present there at the same time, close enough to be caught in the frame, close enough to cast a shadow on the ground, but faceless, just like the man in the dark corner that the camera had only captured in reflection. Third, and most incriminating, the film roll containing that photo was not found in Marina's room, not at her family's home, but forgotten in Paul's shoebox on the garage shelf. Meaning, somehow, after Marina vanished, Paul not only had her obvious belongings, wallet, bracelet, badge, but also kept the film roll that she or her friends had shot. The investigator immediately cross-referenced the photo with old photos of Paul from 1992 from DMV records, administrative papers. They used body proportion analysis software, comparing the relative height of the shadowy figure to Marina's estimated height, based on medical records and descriptions. The results were not absolute numbers, but showed proportions of head, shoulders, torso, closely matching Paul's data in his 30s. Combined with the position of the bright streak on the back of the left hand, matching the position of the stitched injury recorded in the old hand treatment file, the photo became part of the larger picture the prosecutor was building, a chain of circumstances no longer possible to call random. In the meeting with the prosecution, the investigators spread the large printed photo on the table. They pointed to Marina. Victim, September 1992, the parking lot behind Pacific. They pointed to the gray van. Type matching many witness descriptions. Matching the vehicle he owned at that time. They pointed to the shadowy man. Body size and scar position matching Paul Devereaux's records. Then they pointed to the handwritten note on the film canister case, enlarged, Sept. 92, P. Ave, a handwriting that preliminary examination suggested was highly likely Paul's, based on comparison with old signatures and documents. A jury would not need to hear about AI. would not need to understand algorithms to grasp the intuition. If Paul had only accidentally picked up Marina's wallet from trash, why was the film roll with her photo next to his van in his possessions? If he did not know who she was, why keep those everyday moments of hers, moments that could only exist if he was close to her, close enough to hand her the camera or snap her in the middle of the parking lot? For the investigation team, that forgotten Kodak roll was like a small time machine, taking them back to a few seconds of an afternoon in 1992, when everything was still unbroken. Marina awkwardly smiling at the lens, the gray van parked behind her, the shadowy man at the edge of the frame, one hand hiding a scar not yet fully healed. What happened after that photo was taken remained unclear. The film roll ended a few frames later, then nothing, as if someone had never taken it to be developed. But its presence in Paul's shoebox, along with everything else, reinforced one truth: no one in the investigation room dared deny anymore. Paul Devereaux did not just know about the disappearance in Stockton. He had been present in Marina's life, in the back parking lot, in the frames that he or someone very close to him had created, then hidden away with the other traces, hoping time would bury them forever under dust and insulation batting. The small film canister, with its faded yellow Kodak logo, became one of the pieces of evidence the prosecutor pointed to most when building the prosecution strategy, a scrap of the past that could not be brushed away with words like, "I don't remember," an image nailing the connection between victim, vehicle, and the man suspected for 3 decades. After the nylon bag from the ceiling and the Kodak film roll from the shoebox, everyone on the team felt they had enough to proceed with an arrest. But the prosecution remained cautious. They wanted one more thing, not physical evidence, but something harder to deny. Paul revealing himself, in his own words, in a way the jury could hear every syllable. That was when the electronic surveillance tactic came into play. Based on the entire chain of evidence already collected: the 1992 parking ticket, the AI-restored video, the scar record, the bedside statement, the nylon bag from the ceiling, the film roll with photos of Marina and the gray van, the prosecutor filed for a wiretap warrant on Paul Devereaux's phones. The federal judge reviewed the file, asked questions about necessity and the degree of intrusion, then finally signed the order. For a limited period, all calls on Paul's landline and the cell number he regularly used would be recorded, solely for the Marina Soltero investigation. A small surveillance team was set up. They sat in a darkened room at the station, headphones on, screens showing active lines. Their job was mostly waiting. The first few days, the recordings were nothing but mundane calls. Paul talking to a clinic about an appointment, calling a hardware store for prices, answering an old acquaintance about roof repairs. His voice was flat, sometimes curt. Nothing like someone panicking because their deepest secret was about to be exposed. The investigators reminded each other to be patient. Someone carrying a 30-year burden does not always spill it after a few days of knowing they're under suspicion. They knew Paul understood the police were looking at him. He had seen the search warrant, had been questioned about the origin of Marina's belongings, so his guardedness was obvious. But they also knew something else. People cannot keep that defensive mask on forever, especially when talking to those they think are safe. About 2 weeks after the wiretap was activated, on a late weekday evening, a light on the monitoring board lit up, signaling an outgoing call from Paul's home line to a number in another city registered to Linda Devereaux, his ex-wife, someone the investigators had noted in the relationship chart but had not yet interviewed deeply because the two had been estranged for years. One of the monitoring officers adjusted the volume, hit record, and tightened the headphones. Linda's voice came first, a mix of anger and weariness. "I heard they came to your house again. What is it this time, Paul?" "I would and Pat. They camped too. I would and Pleasidal." Paul sighed into the phone. A long sigh the mic picked up along with the rustle of fabric as he leaned back in his chair. "It's that old Stockton thing again. They turned the house upside down, took stuff I forgot I even kept." "You mean that missing girl case?" Linda asked, her voice lowering. "Paul, you've told me your whole life you had nothing to do with it." There was a short silence. Faint TV in the background, the sound of a car passing outside. Then Paul said, slowly, as if weighing each word, I said, I didn't kill anyone. That response made everyone in the monitoring room sit up straight. No one had asked him about killing Linda, had only mentioned the missing girl case, yet Paul chose to deny that exact word. Linda did not catch the detail, or was used to his roundabout way of speaking. She shot back, but why was her stuff in your house? They told me already. Wallet, bracelet, badge. Paul, who do you expect to believe you just found that stuff in a dumpster and hid it in the ceiling? Paul got agitated, his voice suddenly tight. I told them. I told you. No one saw me do anything that night. No camera. No one saw me put anyone in the van. No one knows what happened. Linda was silent for a few seconds. Then she lowered her voice to an almost inaudible whisper, but the recording system caught it clearly. Only you know, right? Another pause. The monitoring officer could hear his own heartbeat through the headphones. Then Paul let out a dry laugh, a laugh with no humor in it. Only me and her. But her, he stopped. Linda cut in, voice trembling. Paul, don't say any more. At that point, if the call had ended, they already had enough for the prosecutor to argue Paul was speaking like someone with consciousness of guilt. But he went further, perhaps out of frustration, perhaps wanting to prove he was still one step ahead of the police. He added a line that the prosecution would later play on repeat for the jury. They can search forever, Linda. No one's going to find her. That sentence dropped into the silence like a stone sinking into water. Linda started crying on the other end. My God, Paul, do you hear what you're saying? Paul did not answer directly. He lowered his voice, almost muttering. No body. No case. They've just got some old stuff, and guys who like making up stories, decades now. And I'm still here, aren't I? In the monitoring room, the phrase, no body, no case, was immediately flagged in the transcript. It was the language of someone who understood all too well how the legal system worked, and believed that missing one piece, the body would collapse the whole prosecution structure. But even more crucial was, no one's going to find her. It was not the statement of an innocent man frustrated at being wrongly suspected. It was the statement of someone relying on the victim's permanent disappearance as a legal shield. If Paul had truly just found Marina's belongings, as he had tried to explain, a more logical response would be, they won't find anything linking it to me. Instead, he said no one will find her, no one will find Marina. The pronoun her here, in the context of the entire conversation about the missing girl in Stockton, could not be interpreted any other way. The call continued for a few more minutes, drifting into old recriminations between two former spouses. Linda talked about how he had never faced the consequences of his actions. Paul responded with bitterness. All I did was keep living. And her. Then he stopped again, as if even he did not want to finish the sentence. When the call ended, in the monitoring room, no one spoke for a long while. Then one person took off the headphones and said quietly, we just heard him admit two things. That she's no longer alive, and that he believes what he did to her is the only thing that's kept him safe all this time. The recording was copied, chain of custody secured, sent to the lead investigator and the prosecutor. In a closed-door meeting, they played the "no one's going to find her" segment over and over, each time noting the tone in Paul's voice. Not aggressive defiance like "just try," but a kind of self-reassurance, mixed with a slight tremble, from someone starting to realize that the things he thought time had buried forever were being uncovered one by one. The nylon bag in the ceiling, the film roll in the shoebox, the 1992 ticket found in the wrong folder, the blurry frames clarified by AI, the bedside statement from the old friend. Now it was his own mouth speaking the truth he had only dared think for 30 years, that there was a her he had done something to so thoroughly that no one would find her. In the prosecution strategy, the prosecutor marked this recording as a pillar. It did not provide coordinates to where Marina lay. The phrase, "no one's going to find her," even implied the location was very hard to access or had been altered beyond tracing. But it showed the jury clear consciousness of guilt. Paul did not say, "I'm innocent." He said they'll never find the victim. That was the argument of someone not disputing what he had done, but clinging to one evidentiary gap he believed still existed. The only thing he had not counted on was that by 2021, police no longer needed a body to reconstruct the story. They had an entire chain of physical traces, statements, images, and now, his own voice, unintentionally placing himself in the picture he had spent 3 decades trying to stay out of. The wiretap and the nylon bag from the ceiling had given Stockton PD something they had never had before. A central suspect not just pointed to by intuition, but by physical evidence and his own words. The next step, for both investigators and prosecutors, was to turn that scattered chain of clues into a seamless story. A 24-hour timeline around the moment Marina vanished, tight enough to leave no gaps for Paul to slip through. They started by laying everything out on the table literally. On the wall, a large new whiteboard was set up dedicated to Marina timeline, 24 hours. On the left was the Marina column. On the right, the Paul column. In the middle were smaller notes. The parking lot, the gray van, the student ID, the canvas bag on the road, the parking ticket, the Kodak film roll, witness A's statement, the wiretap recording. The first thing was to reposition what they knew for sure about Marina in the day before she disappeared. Her last shift at the Brookhaven, store closing time, co-workers' accounts of her saying she would go straight home after work, the camera image of her stepping out the back door into the lot, the student ID dropped in the narrow path. Then, nothing. Each marker was pinned to the left column with yellow sticky notes. On the right column, they began filling in the blanks with what they now knew about Paul. When questioned earlier, Paul had claimed that on the day Marina disappeared, he was working all day out in Lodi, never came back to Stockton that afternoon or evening, and got home before it was fully dark. That was the story he had repeated when investigators first knocked in 2019, the kind of statement that sounded reasonable if there was no reason to doubt it. But now, with the digitization project and digging everything back up, they could test those claims. Old invoices, work appointment logs, notes in a notebook Paul had kept from the 90s seized during the search. On one yellowed page, among scribbled lines like fix plumbing, north side, replace carpet, Oak Street, was a line in different ink, Piave, check AC, afternoon. The date matched the day Marina vanished. Cross-referenced with a handwritten invoice found in another box, an invoice Paul issued to a small store in the Pacific Avenue block, describing the job as cleaning, maintenance, AC, paid in cash. The investigation confirmed. Midday and afternoon that day, Paul had been in the commercial area where Marina worked, completely contradicting his in Lodi all-day statement. They kept digging. In another stack of papers, they found an old gas receipt Paul had clipped the habit of someone who tracked expenses. The receipt was from a station on the route leading to the rural area where Marina's canvas bag was found in 2003. Still the same date, time-stamped after the Brookhaven had closed. The middle timeline suddenly gained a connecting line. From the back lot behind the Brookhaven, through the narrow path where the student ID dropped, along the side road, out to the suburban stretch where the canvas bag was tossed, then onward to the gas station where Paul fueled up. The red arrow drawn on the map now matched both physical evidence locations and financial records. When reminded of his in Lodi all-day claim, Paul could no longer explain why a gas receipt with his signature appeared on that route that very night. He fumbled, saying he didn't remember the exact day, but digitized data from the station stored in the system, cross-checked with shift records, confirmed the receipt could only belong to that date, not another. Another old statement from Paul began to crack. On the timeline, the investigators marked, afternoon, Paul at Pacific Avenue, night, Paul en route, leading to where bag was thrown. In the gap between those two markers, they placed what the camera and the film roll told them. In the afternoon, the Kodak roll showed Marina standing in front of the gray van, half smiling, with the shadowy figure of a man with a faint scar caught at the edge of the frame. The investigators did not know the exact hour the photo was taken, but the light color, shadows, and sequence of frames compared to other daytime shots suggested it was late afternoon, as the sun was lowering. Paul had been in the area according to his notebook and invoice, had the gray van, had the reason check AC, Marina, a young woman working the evening shift at the bookstore, would at least recognize the face of the air conditioning repair guy who came around regularly. The photo showed they had been near each other in a normal context, not a first encounter in the dark lot. That night, the camera captured Marina leaving the back door, eyes turning toward the dark area where the man's reflection appeared on the glass, the hand with the faint scar moving. Just minutes later, based on the time needed to walk through the narrow path, her student ID was presumed dropped near the fence, the first evidence marking the deviation from her usual route. If Paul was the man standing in the darkness, and if he had approached Marina as she stepped out, this possible timeline suddenly became highly organized. Afternoon encounter in the lot, evening return to the back lot, waiting in the spot the camera could not reach, approaching her as she exited, taking her through the narrow path where the ID fell to a pickup point in one of the 3 directions PD had once mapped. The rural gas receipt showed the van, or at least Paul, and the vehicle he drove, had left the city in the exact direction leading to where the canvas bag was tossed. The line, "No one's going to find her," from the wiretap, placed in the exact gap from leaving the lot to the bag being thrown miles away, was no longer a casual remark, but like a punctuation mark in the middle of the timeline. Whatever happened to Marina on that stretch of road was known only to Paul, and he believed the place he left her would forever remain undiscovered. On top of that, PD also revisited what Paul had claimed about the morning after. He said he slept at home, got up late, then drove straight to another job in Lodi. But old landline phone data pulled from the service provider, stored in digitized archives, showed a call from Paul's home phone to a store number on Pacific Avenue the next morning. The content was not saved, but the call log proved he was still tied to the area, at least by phone, contradicting the picture of completely cutting ties with Stockton he described. When questioned again about that call, Paul said don't remember, then self-corrected, probably rescheduling a repair day. The more pieces like this were fitted together, the clearer one thing became. The timeline Paul had told police, both in old interviews and recent conversations, was full of blind spots. Don't remember exactly curves. I was in Lodi all day, claims shattered by documents and evidence. Meanwhile, the timeline PD built, based on objective data, matched frighteningly well with the direction Marina was taken. From the back lot where the van parked, through the narrow path where the ID fell, out to the suburban road, where the bag was thrown, to the gas station, where Paul fueled, then disappearing into the darkness between city and countryside. On the whiteboard, the left column Marina, and right column Paul, gradually connected with arrows, to the point they were no longer 2 separate columns, but 2 layers of the same story. The investigators' work from then on was no longer find more clues, but making this story clear and consistent enough to take into court, proving that every denial from Paul about not being there, not involved, just found the stuff collapsed before a timeline where every segment was anchored by paperwork, images, audio, and the invisible gap where Marina vanished, the gap that he himself had unintentionally outlined with the words, "No one's going to find her." The decision to arrest Paul Devereaux was not made with some impulsive nod, but was the result of months piecing together the timeline, meeting with prosecutors, checking every legal loophole. No body had once been the shield Paul himself believed he could hide behind. But now, on the district prosecutor's desk was a thick file, the 1992 parking ticket in the lot behind Pacific Avenue, the analog video restored by AI showing the hand with the scar, the medical record noting the laceration on the back of the left hand, the bedside statement from the old friend, the nylon bag from the Lodi ceiling with Marina's wallet, bracelet, badge, the Kodak film roll with photos of her standing next to the gray van, the wiretap recording with the words, "No one's going to find her," and the 24-hour timeline proving every one of Paul's "I wasn't there" claims was fabricated. Each piece separately could be attacked by defense counsel, but put together, they formed a circle the prosecution believed was enough to meet the beyond a reasonable doubt threshold. A grand jury was convened in secret, hearing the presentation of each piece of evidence, in turn. They did not see Paul's face, but they saw photos of Marina, heard her mother's words in an old interview clip, heard Paul's voice on the tape saying no one's going to find her, saw pictures of the dusty nylon bag with her belongings pulled down from the ceiling. The result was a formal indictment. Arrest Paul Devereaux on charges related to the abduction and causing the death of Marina Soltero, even though the victim's body had never been found. The arrest warrant was signed and sent to both Stockton PD and the sheriff's department in the county where Paul lived and worked. The arrest team decided not to raid his house before dawn, avoiding a chaotic neighborhood spectacle. Instead, they chose to take him at his workplace, a roof repair job for a small church in Lodi, where the space was controllable, few people around, and plainclothes officers could blend in without drawing attention. That morning, the weather was mild, sun just rising. Paul arrived at the site as usual, toolbox dragging behind him, work jacket faded from paint and dust. He climbed onto the roof, started removing old shingles, unaware that below in the yard, several unmarked vehicles had quietly parked. Some officers in plain clothes stood chatting with the priest, pointing up at the roof as if asking about the repairs. When Paul slid down to get more tools, feet barely touching the concrete, he found 3 men standing in a triangle facing him. 2 Stockton detectives' faces he had seen in recent interviews, the third a local sheriff's deputy. A badge was held up. A paper read in a clear but not loud voice, "Arrest warrant for Paul Devereaux, related to the disappearance and suspected murder of Marina Soltero in 1992. Those present that day said there was no shouting, no running, no struggle. Paul stood still for a few seconds, hand still gripping the hammer, eyes moving from the badge to each man's face. There was a very brief moment that one of the detectives later admitted he had braced to lunge, in case Paul tried to bolt. But Paul just slowly set the hammer down on the ground, raised both hands forward in the reflex of someone who had seen too many arrest scenes on TV. "I guess it finally came," he said, voice raspy but calm to a chilling degree. The cuffs clicked shut, the small metal sound echoing in the quiet churchyard. A few parishioners passing by stopped, staring in disbelief. To them, Paul was the nice handyman who had fixed leaking roofs, changed light bulbs, cleaned gutters for years, always refusing extra payment beyond the invoice, sometimes doing small jobs for free. No one connected that quiet man to a 33-year-old cold case in Stockton. News of the arrest spread back to Stockton faster than any police car. Within hours, local papers, online news sites, then regional TV channels all ran headlines. Suspect arrested in 1992, Marina Soltero disappearance. Man lived quietly in Lodi for decades. The first images released showed Paul being led from the churchyard, hands cuffed, detectives on either side. He did not duck from cameras, nor stare into lenses. His gaze was somewhere distant, toward the roof he had just been working on, where a minute earlier he still thought the day would be like any other. For Stockton residents, the name Paul Devereaux at first meant nothing. But as media began connecting it to details the prosecution allowed to be released, lived near Pacific Avenue in the early 90s, owned a gray van, left Stockton months after the disappearance, victim's personal items found hidden in his home, a wave of shock began to spread. Old business owners around Pacific Avenue, now mostly retired or elderly, realized they had seen that man somewhere in the back lot, toolbox in hand, emerging from a gray van. "I remember him, but I never would have thought," an old laundromat owner told a reporter, voice trailing off. In Lodi, where Paul had spent his middle and later years, reactions were even more mixed. Neighbors said he kept to himself, but whenever someone needed a faucet fixed or an outlet replaced, he was always willing. They used words like gentle, reserved, a bit eccentric but harmless to describe him. One middle-aged woman recalled, "He walked his dog every evening, said hello to me, talked about the weather. If you told me he was connected to a missing girl, I wouldn't know what to believe anymore." For Stockton PD, the community's reaction, shock, disbelief, then anger, was not surprising. In decades-old cases, the suspect is often not the stranger from elsewhere, but someone who slid into the background of everyday life. The friendly neighbor, the mysterious repairman, the uncle who always stood smoking in the alley. But what struck them was the depth of the shock. Marina Soltero was not a random name. She was a symbol of lingering unease for women in Stockton. Those who grew up with the warning "don't walk alone through the back lot" like a mantra, learning that the suspected cause of that unease had lived peacefully in a small town, just a highway drive away, fixing homes for families, attending church, living as a nice old guy, touched a deep sense of betrayal in the community. At the first press conference after the arrest, the Stockton PD chief stood before a bank of microphones, backdrop the department logo, and a photo of 19-year-old Marina hanging behind. He limited what could be revealed since the case was awaiting trial, but did not hide the fact that this breakthrough came only through the combination of modern technology, file digitization, the persistence of investigators across generations, and the courage of people like Witness A, who decided not to take the secret to the grave. We know the community will struggle to accept that someone who appeared harmless, who lived among us for years, could be charged with something like this, he said. But cold cases do not vanish. They wait for the day someone comes back, opens them with tools we did not have in 1992. Today is one step in that journey, not the end. In the front row, Marina's parents, now both elderly, did not speak. They just held hands, looking at their daughter's image on the screen behind, while reporters snapped photos. They were used to hope followed by disappointment, to new leads turning into dead ends. Police saying suspect arrested did not automatically become absolute faith. They knew the road from charges to conviction was long. But for them, seeing a flesh-and-blood man handcuffed, named Devereaux, standing in court as the defendant in Marina's case, was something they had feared for years they would never see. Meanwhile, in Lodi, people cleaned up the unfinished jobs Paul had left. A new roof not yet completed, a fence unpainted, an outlet unreplaced. That emptiness of dangling tasks, for those who had hired him, was like a miniature image of what Stockton had carried for 33 years. A story without an ending. Arresting Paul Devereaux did not automatically fill that void, but it marked the first time in decades the city could look at the haunting named Marina Soltero and say, someone is finally answering to the law. As for how the story would end, that was a question for the courtroom, the jury, and the next chapters of a journey the investigators in 1992 probably could not have imagined when they first stood beside a young woman's student ID dropped by the fence behind a dark parking lot. The trial began in early 2025, in a not-too-large courtroom in the San Joaquin County Courthouse, but packed tight under the gloomy weight of 33 years of waiting. In the public gallery, there were all kinds of faces: reporters, former employees from stores on Pacific Avenue, women who had lived through the era of "don't walk alone through the back lot," and, in the front row, Marina's parents, now with completely white hair, back slightly stooped, but eyes still fixed on every movement of the man at the defense table. Paul Devereaux appeared in an orange prison jumpsuit, thinner than in old photos, silver hair cut short. He was no longer the nice handyman uncle of Lodi. On paper, he was the defendant in the abduction and murder of a 19-year-old girl, body never found. Defense attorneys sat on either side, thick files in front of them. The prosecutor, who had pursued this case for years, opened with something everyone knew but needed to be said. We do not have a body, but no body does not mean no crime. What you are about to hear is a chain of circumstantial evidence, but when pieced together, it will paint a picture you cannot turn away from. In the early days of the trial, the jury was walked through each link in that chain. First came the nylon bag from the Lodi ceiling. The forensic technician took the stand, holding up the transparent evidence bag containing the old wallet, the silver bracelet engraved M.S., the Bookhaven badge with Marina's name. He explained how the bag was found, how it was sealed, how it matched the 1992 report confirming the family had said these 3 items vanished with Marina. Defense counsel tried to plant doubt. Can you rule out the possibility someone else hid that bag in Mr. Devereaux's house? The technician calmly replied, he was the first and only owner of the home, no prior residents, and the bag was stuffed in the ceiling, not on the living room floor. The question hung in the air. If just found, why not call police? Why not return them? Why hide them overhead for decades? Next was the Kodak film roll. The photo technician projected the image of Marina standing near the gray van on the large screen. He pointed to the corner. This is the victim, in the parking lot behind the commercial strip on Pacific Avenue. This is an unmarked gray van, and here, on the right edge, is part of a man's body that we analyzed for proportions, position, relative height to the victim. He explained how the roll was found in Paul's garage shoebox, how the SEP 92P Ave date matched Marina's disappearance, how the handwriting on the canister matched Paul's in other documents. The jury looked at the screen. Young Marina, squinting in the sun, behind her the gray van. At the edge, the shadow of a man the prosecutor did not need to name, because the whole room knew who they were thinking of. Then came the restored video. The technical expert explained, in the simplest language possible, how they used software to reduce noise, increase contrast, interpolate frames, making the reflection on the glass at the Bookhaven's back door clearer. On the screen, the dark lot from that night appeared. Marina pushing the door open, stepping out, pausing, turning her head, and in the reflection the man's hand with an unusual bright streak running across the back. The prosecution followed with the old medical record noting a roughly 4-centimeter laceration on the back of Paul's left hand, plus recent photos of the scar. The expert compared position, relative length, the way the scar ran diagonally across the back of the hand. No, we are not saying this is a fingerprint, he said. But we are saying there is a long scar in exactly the position the medical record documents, on the hand in the video, and on Mr. Devereaux's hand. Then came the bedside statement. The audio of witness A's voice was played, edited to keep only relevant parts. The courtroom fell silent as the dying man recounted how Paul talked about one night in the parking lot behind the bookstore, about one dumb decision in a lot enough to ruin a person's whole life, about how every time I look at the scar on my hand I remember that night. Defense counsel tried to undermine reliability. He was on strong pain medication. Memory could be affected, correct? But the prosecutor reminded the jury that witness A told the same consistent story, with the same details, to the nurse and then to investigators, and was promised no personal benefit. It was a man with nothing left to lose, deciding to unburden himself before death. Next was the forensic timeline. The lead investigator took the stand, presenting like a teacher in front of a class. On the screen was the 24-hour timeline diagram, with 2 lines, Marina and Paul. He pointed to each marker, Marina's shift end time, the camera image of her leaving, the location where the student ID dropped, the 2003 canvas bag discovery on the road. Then he pointed to Paul's side. Notebook entry P. Ave. Check AC. Afternoon. Invoice for work at a Pacific store. Gas receipt from the station on the route to where the bag was thrown. Phone data for the call the next morning. Every place Paul had said I was in Lodi all day, I didn't return to Stockton that evening was marked in red and countered with objective documents. Every time he said I wasn't there, the investigator concluded. We found a piece of paper or data proving otherwise. Finally, to seal the circumstantial chain, the prosecution played the excerpt from the monitored recording for the jury. Paul's voice to his ex-wife, "No one saw me do anything that night. No one's going to find her." The words "her" and "no one will find" echoed in the courtroom, heavy as stone. Defense counsel countered by repeating 2 points. 1. No one ever saw Paul touch Marina. 2. No body, no determined cause of death. They tried to seed in the jurors' minds that the pile of evidence, though large, was all speculation, that the nylon bag could have been hidden by someone else, the film roll could have been misplaced into Paul's things, the AI video could be distorted, the bedside statement could be warped memory. Will you convict a man based on a stack of could-bes rather than certainties? They asked. But the issue was, for many on the jury, those could-bes overlapped too much, fit too perfectly. In the early days of the trial, Paul sat still, eyes down, posture like someone accustomed to bending under the weight of time. But as more witnesses appeared, more images were shown. More pieces of a past he thought buried were pulled from boxes. His calm began to crack. Defense counsel knew the danger. If it went to jury verdict, with everything heard and seen, their only chance was clinging to no body. But the potential charges the prosecution was pursuing, abduction, special circumstances, murder, carrying a maximum of life without parole, made the practical question urgent. Did they want to gamble to the end, or find a less brutal exit, even if still a life behind bars? In a recess between sessions, after the prosecution had just finished presenting the forensic timeline, defense counsel requested a private meeting with the prosecutor in the negotiation room. No cameras, just attorneys, prosecutor, and one investigator. The tone this time was different from earlier sessions. No longer fierce objections, but the cold realism of those knowing they were on the losing side. My client, the attorney said, still denies intentionally killing Marina, but he admits there was an encounter in the lot, that things went too far, and that he panicked afterward. If the district agrees to reduce from first-degree murder to second-degree murder and abduction, removing the special circumstances that could lead to life without parole, he is willing to plead guilty. It was the moment the prosecution had anticipated. They left the room, consulted Marina's family. Her parents had no legal say in sentencing, but their voice carried moral weight. They did not need long to know what the other thought. At their age, they had few years left for endless appeals. What they wanted, more than a maximum sentence on paper, was a verbal admission from the man who had pulled their daughter into the darkness. They agreed, as long as the sentence was long enough that he would never walk out a free man. A few days later, instead of entering final arguments, the court was informed the defendant wished to change his plea. Paul stood, hands trembling slightly, answering each question from the judge. You understand you are waiving your right to a jury trial? Yes. No one is forcing you to plead guilty? No, Your Honor. What do you plead guilty to? I plead guilty to abduction and second-degree murder of Marina Soltero. The courtroom fell completely silent. It was not the detailed confession many, especially Marina's parents, had still hoped for. The kind of, this is what happened that night, never fully spoken. Paul did not describe what he did with the body, did not reveal the burial place, did not explain why he kept Marina's belongings all those years. His attorney had surely advised against details, but legally, his saying, I plead guilty before the judge, was enough to close the largest chapter of the story. After 33 years, the disappearance of Marina Soltero was no longer labeled an unsolved mystery in the files. It was recorded as an abduction and murder, with a man who had a name, a face, a prison number. The judge pronounced sentence, a combined term for abduction and second-degree murder, with years high enough that, at Paul's age, it was effectively a life sentence. No realistic chance he would ever walk out. When asked if he wished to say anything to the victim's family before being led away, Paul looked toward them for a moment, the first real direct gaze of the entire trial. He opened his mouth, but only managed, I, then closed it, as if a lifetime of burying things could not find the words. Marina's father turned away, not waiting for an apology. He did not need one. He only needed to know that, on the final line of the file, the words unsolved were gone, and the 2025 trial, with its chain of circumstantial evidence strung together like an unbreakable cord, was where those words were crossed out, replaced by a statement. Marina had been taken, and the man who did it had finally been forced to name his own crime. In the final sentencing hearing, after Paul Devereaux entered his guilty plea and the judge read the sentence, the court allowed a moment for something the Soltero family had feared hearing for 33 years, but also longed to have stated officially. Marina was declared dead. Not missing, not status unknown, but taken from life sometime that night in September 1992, in a dark parking lot behind the row of stores on Pacific Avenue. No body, but California law allows the court, based on the guilty plea and the chain of evidence, to issue a death certificate. That piece of paper, to outsiders, is just an administrative form. To Marina's parents, it was the period at the end of a fragile hope that maybe their daughter was still out there somewhere, held, lost, hurt, but breathing. They could not bury her in the literal sense, but finally they had a date to carve on the small memorial stone in the family plot. 1973 to 1992, instead of an endless question mark. News that the case was closed spread quickly, beyond San Joaquin County. Major papers in the state called it one of California's most emblematic cold cases resolved in the decade. A no-body case, no direct eyewitness, but cracked through the combination of a misplaced 1992 parking ticket, an old analog video clarified by AI, a forgotten Kodak film roll, a bedside statement, and a minute-by-minute forensic timeline. Legal columns analyzed the Marina case as a study in the value of circumstantial evidence. No single piece kills, but strung together, they form a cord tighter than any lone proof. New investigator training courses in the state began, including the Marina Soltero case in the curriculum. At cold case seminars, when an instructor asked the room, "Who here has heard of the 19-year-old girl who disappeared in Stockton with no body found?" Nearly every hand went up. The case became a textbook example of two things. 1. The importance of keeping everything from parking tickets to blurry videos because you never know what future technology can do with them. 2. The necessity of never dismissing women being followed reports, faint shadows on cameras, vague anonymous tips. For Stockton PD, the aftermath did not stop at reputation. Internally, they held multiple debrief sessions, not just to pat themselves on the back for the final outcome, but to face head-on the mistakes from 30 years earlier. Young detectives, some not even born when Marina vanished, sat listening to veterans recount how in the 90s, certain reports were seen as too vague, how a parking ticket got misfiled, how no one thought to separately log notable vehicles around the lot, how analog tapes were glanced at and boxed away. From those sessions, a series of procedural changes were drafted. First, every adult missing person case is flagged high risk immediately if there is evidence of unusual behavior disappearing right after a shift, leaving personal items, no contact, no history of running away, instead of letting days pass hoping they come back. Instead of treating the early hours as waiting period, Stockton PD wrote into the operations manual, "The first 24 hours are golden time." Second, processing parking lots once treated as secondary scenes in missing persons near commercial areas was elevated to primary focus. License plates are pulled, logged immediately, stored with the case file rather than lumped into general parking data. All tickets around the disappearance timeframe are scanned, tagged, and the digitized system set to auto-link them to related missing persons files. No more a ticket like Paul Devereaux's drifting into the wrong folder and forgotten for 3 decades. Third, they established a standard protocol for preserving and digitizing video. Old analog tapes are not just eyeballed and stored, but converted to digital at maximum original resolution, saved centrally. Every serious case gets its own video file, so that later, if new technology emerges, it can be reprocessed. The lesson from the faint scarred hand reflected on glass made clear. What the naked eye misses today may stand out tomorrow. Fourth, Stockton PD formalized a small but dedicated cold case unit. Instead of letting old cases float among detectives as side work, that unit is directly linked to IT, forensics lab, DMV, and state databases, ensuring things like gray van lists, tickets, gas receipts are no longer scattered on paper but cross-queryable in clicks. The Marina investigation showed plainly, connecting a gas receipt to a roadside bag and an old parking ticket is not detective genius, but good data infrastructure. Fifth, they wrote an internal guideline on handling deathbed statements and indirect accounts like witness A's. Instead of dismissing because the speaker is not 100% sure, officers are trained to assess reliability based on motive, consistency, and fit with physical evidence. Remarks like, "I heard him talk about one night behind the bookstore," are no longer treated as noise but as leads to test against the forensic frame. Beyond procedure, the aftermath lay in community emotion. Every year, around the date Marina disappeared, her family, old friends, and former Pacific Avenue co-workers gather at a small spot the city unofficially calls Marina's Corner, a metal plaque on the brick wall, engraved with her name, birth year, death year, and the line, "In memory of all those who never made it home." Not every memorial is loud. Most are just a few dozen people standing quietly, laying flowers, touching the plaque, then dispersing. But having a specific place to go, not an empty parking lot or a file in storage, anchors the grief, keeps it from floating aimlessly. For women in Stockton, the case closing came with a feeling hard to name. Many now mothers or grandmothers, once the young girls walking dark lots in the 90s, say, knowing the man who took Marina will die in prison brings justice, but does not erase the root unease. Some still do not walk alone through backlots, do not let daughters work late shifts at stores. Not because Marina was not avenged, but because now they know clearly, the man who looks like the gentlest uncle can be the one who once stood in the glass-door darkness, hand with a faint scar. And for the investigators themselves, the Marina Soltero case became a quiet reminder of both sides of the job. On one hand, it shows how long, how many generations, how much new technology, how many lucky flips of the right paper it can take to reassemble a truth one man tried to hide in his ceiling. On the other, it tells them that the work they do, from carefully noting a seemingly trivial parking ticket, to keeping an old Kodak roll, to sitting hours, rewatching analog tape, might be what someone 30 years later needs to reopen a door thought forever shut. Somewhere in California's cold case storage, there are still files labeled missing, no body, unsolved. But after Marina, every time a young detective passes those boxes, he does not just see paper and dust. He sees a 19-year-old girl stepping out the back door, turning at a sound in the darkness, and knows that if he gets every small step right today, someday 10, 20, 30 years from now, someone may finish telling a story still unfinished. And that is the most important aftermath after 33 years. Not just one man locked behind bars, but an entire system, learning how never to let names like Marina Soltero disappear a second time in its own files. When looking back at the journey to justice for Marina Soltero, we do not just see a case in Stockton in 1992, but a mirror of American life today, where every dark parking lot, every gentleman in the community, every parking ticket or old Kodak roll can be the line between safety and tragedy. The fact that a 1992 parking ticket was misfiled and forgotten for 26 years reminds us that in everyday life, the small details, a sighting of a gray van lurking, a gut feeling when someone follows you, are never small. If the women Paul once stalked had reported more forcefully, if warnings about the guy who hangs around the back lot had been taken seriously from the start, perhaps Marina would have had a different chance. The fact that a forgotten Kodak roll in a shoebox later became evidence shows we all have a responsibility to preserve truth, from home security cameras, Ring doorbells, to not deleting suspicious messages or emails related to violence or harassment. Witness A's bedside statement reminds us of complicit silence. He lived decades with the words, "one night behind the bookstore," without daring to report, speaking only when death was near. In today's America, where women, immigrants, young people still face violence in very ordinary spaces, the lesson is, do not dismiss intuition. Do not fear bothering police when you see someone like Paul stalking or prowling. And if you know something, speak up early. Call 911. Call the tip line. Report to campus security, instead of waiting until guilt weighs too heavy. Finally, the fact that Stockton PD dared to examine its mistakes, digitize files, use AI to restore old video, shows something positive. The system can change if the community demands and oversees it. The lesson for every American is not just be careful in dark parking lots, but to become the eyes, ears, and memory of your own community, because sometimes one piece of information you hold on to today is what will bring justice to another Marina years from now. If you believe stories like Marina's deserve to be heard and invisible victims need a voice, please subscribe to the channel and share this video so more people can stay vigilant and speak up. Thank you for staying with us to the end of this 33-year journey for justice. We'll see you in the next videos, where we'll continue telling stories thought forgotten, so no name ever vanishes in silence again.